Hey, everybody, I'm Duncan Crabtree Ireland. I'm the National Executive Director, Chief Negotiator of SAG-AFTRA, and I'm super excited to be here with you today to talk about the tentative agreement that we reached with the AMPTP for a new TV theatrical contract. So as you know, the National Board last Friday voted to send the agreement to you, the members, and recommended ratification. And we know there are a lot of questions that people have about this expansive agreement, and so we're going to dive into that in just a moment. But before we do that, I wanted to just take a moment to thank all of you, all of our members, for your support and engagement every step of the way in this process, from the wages and working conditions, the W&W meetings process that we started back in December of last year, to voting for the strike authorization so that we could go into the negotiations with a maximum amount of leverage, and throughout the long negotiation process, longer than we expected, and of course, during the historic 118-day strike. You have shown the world the meaning of unity and the power of collective bargaining. And because of your support, we have the power to change the future of what this industry looks like. So that's not just for our members, that's really for everyone who works in film, television, and streaming. And that really isn't an exaggeration. So let's get into it. I am very, very pleased and honored to do this presentation together with SAG-AFTRA's Chief Contracts Officer, Ray Rodriguez, who served as our co-lead negotiator on this agreement. We're going to do, we have some slides to go over with you as we go through the presentation. And as was mentioned earlier, at the end of the presentation, then the Q&A function will go live, and we will use the rest of the time that we have today to answer questions. I do want to assure you this is not the only chance people will have to get this information or to ask questions, etc. We will have additional webinars, and we will have even some live and in-person informational meetings. So more information will be coming out about that shortly. And for anyone who hasn't already, please do check out our website, where you can see the summary of the agreement and look through that at your own pace. Hopefully you've already seen it. We also have some great additional information there, and FAQs and some information about AI as well. So if we could go ahead and start the slide deck, that would be great. And yeah, that's the name of the agreement. So yay, we can move on to our next slide. So want to just talk about the overall value of this contract. Really pleased with what we ultimately were able to negotiate, which is more than $1 billion in new compensation and benefit plan funding. And that's including a projected increase of just slightly less than $700 million, $697.6 million in wages and residuals during the 31.5-month term of this contract, and about $317.2 million in the form of additional contributions into the SAG-AFTRA Health Plan, the SAG Producers Pension Plan, and the AFTRA Retirement Fund. And as we go through the presentation, we'll highlight for you where those additional wages and where those additional contributions come from in the different specific parts of this agreement. So why don't we start out by talking about minimums? And let me just, and so we can go on to the next slide. Let me just say, first of all, the minimums increase in this contract has broken the so-called industry pattern. And that's something that in and of itself is hugely important and hugely valuable, not just for us, but for other unions in this industry for the future. Because up until now, that has not happened. That has not happened in decades of bargaining with the AMPTP. Nobody has been able to break the so-called pattern. But this cycle, we were able to do that thanks to the unity, solidarity, and support of our members. And that's resulted in a wage pattern where we have two increases within the first year of the contract. We have an immediate general wage increase of 7% that took effect on the 9th of November. And we'll have an additional 4% increase that'll take effect on July 1st of next year. When those two increases are compounded, by July 1st of 2024, that'll be a compounded 11.28% increase in the first year of this contract, plus an additional 3.5% increase effective on July 1st of 2025. And I want to acknowledge that when we started out this negotiation, we had proposed a higher minimum wage increase than that. And throughout the negotiation, this became a very intense point of contention between the companies and us, with the AMPTP saying they would never go above the pattern, and us saying you are going to have to go over the pattern in order to make a deal, because we need to have sufficient increases in minimums to help mitigate the impact of inflation on our members so that they are not making less money going forward than they did a few years ago. And so the good news is that the combination of these increases does achieve that goal, and we're excited about that. Obviously, we would have liked to have an even higher wage increase, and I'll be really excited to talk to you about how that played out in the context of background actors increases in a few minutes. But this is an increase that does achieve that core goal that we sought in this negotiation. If we want to move on to our next piece, it's been a hot topic all throughout the weekend. People have been talking about our provisions regarding artificial intelligence, and I think it's natural that people are excited to know more about it, because this is such a crucial area. And frankly, nobody has negotiated really detailed, specific provisions regarding AI prior to this negotiation. So what you'll find in this agreement are comprehensive rules for both informed consent and fair compensation for our members. And I want to talk about what all of the details of that are, but I want to start out by just acknowledging there are some aspects of this agreement that aren't perfect. And in the AI provisions, we fought so hard on AI from day one of the negotiations all the way to the very last day. In fact, the very last piece of this deal to come together, the very last piece of the puzzle, was on AI on day 118 of the strike. So please know that this negotiating committee, this negotiating team, fought so hard to get the best possible protections in artificial intelligence. But obviously, as you know, we're up against some of the biggest companies in the world. And as President Drescher says, we all play our hand. So this hand that we have played, from my perspective, achieves the goals that we set out to ensure that our members have protection, to ensure that informed consent and fair compensation are respected. So first part of this agreement has to do with employment-based digital replicas. What that really means is when a producer hires you to work in a project, and as part of that, they create a digital replica of you. If that's going to happen, you're entitled to get 48 hours notice if they intend to do it. They have to give you clear and conspicuous consent, give you clear and conspicuous, reasonably specific information about the intended use of the digital replica. And any time that you spend creating digital replica is paid work time. Then for when they actually are going to use the digital replica in that project, they have to pay you compensation based on the time it would have taken for you to do that work if you did it in person. So that's the measure. And that does include P&H contributions, and it does include residuals. So understand that you have this right to informed consent, meaning that you have to be told in advance, you have to be given the reasonably specific information about the intended use of the digital replica, which you can say yes or no to, and then you have the right to negotiate for the minimum compensation or above for the use of that digital replica with the measurement that I just talked about. Note that also you have an additional right of consent separately, not at the time of initial employment, for any other use of this employment-based digital replica. The sole exception to that is if there is a multi-picture project where there are other specifically identified projects that are part of that engagement, then they can, if they can give you the reasonably specific informed consent information, they can do all of that at the initial engagement point. But other than for those multi-picture projects that fit into that definition, any kind of subsequent use of that employment-based digital replica can only be done with consent obtained at the time of use. There's also this concept of independently created digital replicas. That's when the company licenses a digital replica of you, perhaps from you or from some company that you might have teamed up with to make a digital replica of you that you make available for use in projects. So there might be a time when a studio or a streamer decides to license that. Instead of engaging you on the project, they just want to license your digital replica for use in a project. If that happens, and we don't expect that to be a very common use during the term of this contract, but it is a possibility, there is an additional requirement of informed consent, just like on the employment-based digital replicas. And that's super important because that means that even though you may have licensed the digital replica to them, or you may be partnering with a company that's doing that, you will have your own individual right to know, to get that informed consent information, that reasonably specific information about the intended use of the digital replica, and you'll have an independent right to say yes or no to that. And you will have a right, of course, to negotiate additional compensation for that if you want to do that on top of whatever the license deal is to acquire the right to use the digital replica from you in the first place, and get P&H contributions paid on top of that. We can go on to the next slide. So there's other pieces to the artificial intelligence provisions as well. It's a very detailed and specific set of provisions, many, many, many pages of contract language. One of them has to do with digital alteration. And digital alteration is sort of a separate concept from the creation of the digital replicas that we were just talking about. Digital alteration is about taking these AI tools and digital tools and using it to make adjustments to the performance that's been rendered in the project. And so really the concept that underlies this is the same types of things that these producers could do now using traditional editing techniques, using CGI, VFX, et cetera, will be allowed to be done using AI tools instead. And so the limitations on that include, first of all, anything outside the scope of what we're about to talk about, any kind of digital alteration, requires that informed consent that we've already talked about. So there are a few things they can do just as a matter of course in terms of their post-production process. Anything that they do there, it has to remain substantially as scripted, performed, or recorded. So they can't go create new scenes that aren't in the script that you didn't already perform in or anything like that without getting your informed consent, as we already talked about. But things like making post-production alterations to address dubbing issues, to adjust lip and face movements, et cetera, to facilitate the translation, and a list of other kinds of traditional post-production things like taking care of a glitch in the audio or taking care of adjusting something to fit for ratings purposes. Things like that are covered by this provision. So they can do those things, but they can't expand that into changing your performance or creating a new scene or anything of that nature. That's all strictly limited without your informed consent. Then let's talk about generative AI. This has been a topic that everyone has been very interested in. And for those who aren't that familiar with it, we have some explainers on the website or other things that you can go take a look at, including videos of panels we've done and things like that about what generative AI is. But in essence, what we're talking about here is technology that can be used to take a number of inputs and then use to generate a synthetic output, which we're calling synthetic fakes. So it's like creating synthetic fake performers. We did achieve a broad and very protective definition of generative AI in this agreement, and we achieved an obligation on the part of the companies to give us notice anytime that they're going to use generative AI to try and create a synthetic fake performer. And in addition to that, we have the right to bargain with them over appropriate compensation or consideration for any use of that type, of any type of generative AI used to create a synthetic fake performer. And finally, one of the pieces that came together at the very end is there is going to be an informed consent right for any performer who has a facial feature, a recognizable facial feature incorporated into a synthetic fake performer. So if their name or is used to prompt a generative AI system to create a character that has a recognizable smile, for example, or somebody's eyes or other facial features, those individual performers, however many of them may be implicated in that, all have an individual right of consent and have to be contacted, and consent has to be secured from them by the producer before they can do that. Finally, we have an agreement that we're going to meet semi-annually, twice a year, with the companies to discuss generative AI, including efforts to find out what exactly they intend to do in the future with generative AI and help to make sure that generative AI isn't used in a way that perpetuates any kind of biases that might have crept into the system. Because, of course, whenever you train a generative AI system on things that have happened in the past, you're essentially training that algorithm to repeat the things that have happened in the past. And I think we all know that we want to move into a future where things are different than they were in the past in a lot of ways, especially as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that's an important piece of this agreement as well. So if we can go on to the next slide, that'd be great. So let's talk about background actors for a minute. There are really strong protections for background actors as it relates to artificial intelligence in this agreement. First of all, let's talk about digital replicas of background actors. Just like with principal performers, if a producer wants to engage a background actor and create a digital replica of them, they have to give advance notice, 48 hours notice of their intention to do that. And they have to secure the informed consent of the background actor with reasonably specific details about the intended use of the digital replica. Any kind of use, by the way, if they try to use that digital replica then to create a principal performance out of it, then any kind of use like that will require that the background actor be paid as a principal, including any kind of additional pension and health contributions and residuals based on the amount of time that it would have taken to do the work. And one of the really great provisions of this agreement is that the background count cannot be satisfied by using digital replicas. That means all of the positions that are called for, all of the covered background slots in our contract that are called for, have to be filled by hiring SAG-AFTRA covered background actors. They cannot be filled by using digital replicas. And if a background performer who's hired has a digital replica created, and that digital replica is then used, that digital replica cannot be used to evade the engagement of that background actor. Meaning, when you combine those two provisions together, if a background actor has a digital replica made, they're going to have to be paid for any use of that, and the employer cannot circumvent hiring them or paying them for the hours that they would have worked in the event that a digital replica is used instead of them. So this protects our background actors' jobs, and it also makes sure that if they have a digital replica created of them, that they get compensated properly for doing that. That really slides right into those concepts of informed consent and fair compensation. I want to note that there is also a requirement for consent and compensation for use in any kind of other pictures. So if the digital replica is then used in some other way in the future, that can only be done with the informed consent of the background actor and with the compensation that's called for. The digital alteration provisions for background actors are very similar to the principal one, so I won't just repeat them, but there is one nuance that I did want to specifically mention, which is if a digital alteration is made to a background actor's performance that adjusts their lip or facial movements to make it look like they are speaking a line, then that will trigger an upgrade to principal. So obviously, if you're using a digital AI technology to make the background actor look like they're speaking a line, then they're going to be treated as though they did speak that line and be compensated accordingly. We can go on to the next slide, I think. Ray, I think this is where you take over for me on this one.
Sure. So as you know, we have prioritized a high budget SVOD streaming bonus as part of this organization, as part of this negotiation rather, and trying to bring our contract into better alignment with the world of streaming. And so for performers that are working on a high budget SVOD season of a series or a mini series or a long form picture that hit a defined success metric, there is going to be an additional payment. So that success metric requires that the production be watched by at least 20% of the domestic subscribers to that streaming service within the first 90 days of that exhibition year. And if it does attract that level of viewership, then there will be a bonus paid that is equal to 75% of the applicable residual. So be an additional 75% residual that goes to the performers on the triggering program. And then another 25% of the money will go to a streaming bonus distribution fund. This is going to be a jointly trusteed fund that will take that additional 25% of the money and develop a set of distribution guidelines so that that money can be distributed more broadly than simply to the programs that trigger the success metric. Next slide, please. I'll take this one as well, the advanced pay of residuals. One of the problems that we know we've had in the area of advanced pay of residuals is people not realizing that money that they thought was actually initial compensation in their deal was actually the prepayment of their residuals, and then becoming understandably upset later when those residuals don't materialize because unbeknownst to them, they've already been paid for that. So these changes add transparency so that you know how much of your episodic money is actually and how much is the prepayment of residuals. That's accomplished by having a completely separate rider for advanced pay, so it's going to be a standalone document that you have to sign, and separate checks unless you're going through a direct deposit payment. so that the residuals, the advance paid residuals component, will be processed by the union just like a residuals check, and you'll get it in the manner in which you get your residuals to make it even more apparent to you that that is residuals money. We're going to get some better reporting out of that as well. And we have an additional limitation that not more than 15% of a performer's guaranteed compensation can be treated as an advance payment of residuals if you are guaranteed less than $75,000 per week or per episode. So that's a further cap on how much that can be advance paid. And the traditional thresholds that also govern how much can be advance paid have increased as well. Next slide. For high budget SVOD, these are high budget programs made for subscription-based streaming services. There have been a number of improvements to this formula. As a reminder, this formula works by taking what you were paid on the program, which we call total actual compensation, what you were paid, subjecting that to a cap, multiplying that by a percentage based on which exhibition year it is. So it's a declining percentage as the program gets older, and then taking the result of that multiplication and subjecting it to a subscriber factor so that it can either be increased if it's on a bigger platform or decreased if it's on a smaller platform. With that as background, the changes that we made include increasing the caps that are applied to your total actual compensation by 2.5%, removing grandfathering for any new seasons of an existing series. So some series have been subjected to older formulas as this formula has been improved over the years, and that grandfathering will go away so that the new seasons benefit from the best version of this formula. We had a significant increase to the foreign residuals. Basically, the foreign residuals used to be 35% of your domestic residuals. It's now its own formula, its own subscriber factor that gets applied using the same calculation as a domestic residual. So that is a very significant increase to the foreign residual. The 35% crediting of scale to be applicable to certain smaller platforms has been eliminated, so that 35% of crediting went away. The domestic SVOD residual also increased. I mentioned that there are subscriber factors that can increase the residual for bigger platforms and decrease it for smaller platforms. The last two of those subscriber factors, the two smallest, have been eliminated. And so for programs on smaller platforms, that increases the residual applicable to them. We also increased the percentages of total applicable compensation due for exhibition in years 8 through 12. So when your total actual compensation to a cap is multiplied against that factor, that's going to be a higher percentage now for older programs. And we have brand new transparency and reporting obligations on the part of the producer that gives us some insight into what has been a black box in terms of how programs perform on these SVOD services. So we're now going to get additional streaming viewership details to inform what we know about how these programs are doing. Next slide, please. Forgive me. Some additional residuals changes. We have a modification to the promotional rerun of a new network primetime series so that it's any 3 episodes that can be run in the promotional window rather than necessarily being the first 3 episodes. We have a provision that allows for a percentage of distributors' gross receipts based formula to be paid for a limited theatrical exhibition of a television program, and high budget SVOD pictures 66 minutes or longer, so feature length streaming has been added to that provision. There's been a modification to the theatrical promotional exhibitions. That is what we just talked about. The foreign overage thresholds increased by 3%. That affects how residuals are paid for foreign free television, where it's initially a fixed residual at 35% of TAM that now is going to, and that after that fixed residual is paid, it can switch to a distributor's gross receipts based residual once the license revenue has, once license revenue has exceeded certain amounts, and those amounts will go up by 3%. And we've made some changes to the new media inspection rights so that they're done once per year and on 30 days notice, as opposed to semi-annually on 10 days notice as they are now. Next slide, please. We made some changes to the casting process. This was an issue that was of tremendous interest to members during the W&W process, who felt strongly that the self-tape casting process had gotten out of hand and needed rules and parameters, which we've now established. So you will now have at least 48 hours from the time that you get the notice, the request to do a self-tape, to submit your self-tape, 72 hours for minors. There's now a limit on the page counts. That's 8 pages for a first self-tape and 12 for a second or subsequent self-tape. There's a clear prohibition against memorization being required, and you have to be allowed to hold your sides or use a prompter. You will now have increased transparency. The producers will endeavor to respond to you, to tell you whether that role has been cast, so that you can factor that in deciding if that's a self-tape request that you want to respond to. There is a prohibition on any paid editing software or specific equipment. There are some limits now on what can be asked of you in connection with a slate. So there's a standardized set of information for a slate. There's a prohibition on nudity. You can't be asked to wear anything more revealing than a swimsuit you would wear to a public pool. There's a prohibition on stunts being requested in a self-tape. If you are a dancer, there's a requirement now that the producer has to supply the music, has to supply the choreography for your self-tape. It is limited to 4 8-beat counts in terms of the amount that can be asked for you to do, and you can only be asked to do solo performances. You cannot be asked to recruit people for partner dances or anything like that. Your self-tape has to be securely stored and maintained in such a way that only people with a legitimate business purpose can access it. If they want to use your self-tape for any kind of public-facing use, they have to get your consent for that at the time of use. It cannot be made a condition of submitting the self-tape. They have to do that at the time they want to use it. And finally, there is a requirement now that there must be an option for either an in-person or a live virtual, like a Zoom audition, for folks that feel like they don't do their best work on self-tapes. They have the opportunity to use those slots that will be made available for that. And priority there is going to be assigned to performers with disabilities and seniors, but everyone can request those opportunities.
And Ray, before we go on to the next slide, I just want to emphasize in that first bullet that's on this slide that the turnaround time, the 40-hour turnaround, excludes weekends and it excludes holidays. So, I know one of the things that was really important to our members was seeing some protection of the weekends and holidays, and so that is an important part of the limitations that are in this section.
Thank you. Some more changes in the area of the casting process. So for virtual interviews and auditions, again, you have the ability to ask whether the role has been cast. You can't ask to, they cannot ask you to use any paid service, editing software, or specific equipment. Again, you cannot be asked to memorize, or that will trigger payment under the current rules of the schedules. And again, you cannot be asked to appear in anything more revealing than a swimsuit you would wear to a public pool. And there's also a specific provision that you cannot be asked to remove your cover-up until you are in a private virtual setting with only casting personnel. The way disputes will be handled here is that there is first a 6-month moratorium on claims. We have been encouraged to actually report any violations that we find so that producers can adjust to these new rules and bring themselves into compliance. After that, claims will be referred to a conciliation committee where we will attempt to resolve them. If they are not resolved at the conciliation committee, then at that point they can be brought to grievance and arbitration. There are new rules on general casting calls that provide that you cannot be charged a fee for submitting a self-tape or for accessing audition materials, nor may people be given preferential treatment on the basis of whether they've paid a fee. So some of the services that are operating this way, Actors Access and others, are going to have to change the way they're doing business in order to give people access to casting opportunities without having to pay. The AMPTP has agreed to meet with us to discuss discrepancies in different geographic markets in terms of how roles are cast for and paid. And there are specific provisions now referencing the need to accommodate performers with disabilities in the casting process, as well as seniors and minors. Next slide, please.
So I think this is where I take over again, right? So so we have increases to the benefit plan contribution caps for episodic work, both half-hour and 1 hour TV and new media motion pictures, that we project will generate over $180 million in additional contributions to the benefit plans over the course of the contract. I mean, it's worth noting that these caps haven't been raised in a very long time. These increases in contribution caps will help the performers working on those shows to continue qualifying for coverage, in addition to helping better fund the plans and giving us the ability to hopefully make some benefit improvements over the coming months and years. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the increase, for half hours, that increase is from $15,000 to $25,000 in terms of a cap. That's a 67% increase in the limit. And for hours, the limit went from $24,500 to $35,000, and that's a 43% increase in the cap there as well. And so that's a really important move. Obviously, in our original proposal process, we had we did propose to raise these caps to match the change in inflation over that time period. That was not achievable, and the impact of that would have been very hard to accomplish in this negotiation. But the amount of increase that we do have in this will, I think, be very, very beneficial to members and will, in fact, generate a very sizable amount of additional contributions into the plan, as you just heard. We can go on to the next topic, which is performance capture. So we've been trying to get performance capture addressed in this contract, formally recognized in the contract language for several decades, actually more than 20 years. And in this contract term, thanks to all of our members' efforts, thanks to all of the pressure and leverage that was created, we were able to finally achieve a breakthrough in performance capture. So the studios and streamers have agreed to confirm coverage of performance capture services in live action theatrical and television motion pictures and in animated theatrical motion pictures. I note that this negotiation we were not negotiating over television animation, so that's not addressed in this negotiation, but it is addressed in terms of coverage for all of the other areas that this contract does cover. And when our members are doing performance capture work, it will be covered by the terms of the applicable schedule, whether that's Schedule A, B, C, F, G, H, J, with some exceptions. Specifically, and we can talk about what those exceptions are. Specifically, that includes exceptions to consecutive employment and exceptions to drops and pickup rules during this time period. That's something we didn't want to agree to. That's not something that we are excited about, but it was necessary in order to achieve this coverage. And of course, one of the things about collective bargaining is there is someone on the other side, and it is a process of negotiation. So this creates the structure and the recognition that gives us the chance to address those limitations in a future round of bargaining. It's important to note that this performance capture provision doesn't cover motion capture services as defined, which are different than a performance capture service as defined in the agreement. It doesn't cover reference capture or reference modeling, which have been traditional exclusions, certainly in terms of reference modeling for decades. We can go on to Schedule F performers. We have increased minimums in Schedule F, which are going to result in significantly more money in Schedule F performers' pockets. First of all, the theatrical motion picture Schedule F break is going to go from $65,000 up to $80,000. For half-hour TV and new media motion pictures, it'll go from $32,000 to $37,500. And for 1 hour and longer TV and new media motion pictures, it'll go from $32,000 to $45,000. And for multi-part closed-end projects, it'll go from $40,000 to $47,500 per picture. And for more than 4,650 per week to more than 5,150 per week. So when you look at all those increases, they range from 17 to 40% in terms of the increases in the Schedule F thresholds. And that's important because there obviously is this hasn't been increased in recent years in ways that really keep up with how scale has changed and inflation and things of that nature. And on top of that, because of the benefits to the producer of engaging people at Schedule F, there is a pressure to at least meet those Schedule F thresholds. And so we expect that this will generate significant money for people who are currently being engaged as Schedule F performers going forward. And I think, Ray, we're going to turn it back over to you here.
Sure. So some significant changes for series regulars and how options work for series regulars. The money break at which the options protections apply to you has gone up significantly. So for the half hour, it has now gone up to $65,000 per week or per episode. For an hour longer show, it's $70,000 per week or per episode. Those both are up from $32,000. So those are very significant increases, and many more people now qualifying for the protection of the contract. The figure stayed at $32,000 for minors on children's programs. For people who have the benefit of these option protections, what that means is that the option period between seasons is 18 months from the commencement of principal photography on the prior season. So the entire production period of the season is captured within that 18 months. That 18 months can be extended up to 3 times by up to 3 months per extension, and each such extension requires a non-creditable episodic fee. So you got to pay an extra episode for each one of those extensions, cannot be credited against other money. And right now, just to show the comparison, that is 12 months between options, but that starts at the end of principal photography of the prior season, and there were 2 6-month extensions allowed for, so this is added to that. Another significant development is that for the first time, there are time limits on the start date. So once your option has been exercised, how quickly do you have to be returned to work or paid? There is no limit to that in the current agreement, but we now have one, which is 3 months from the end of the option period, and that can be extended once for up to 2 months in exchange for a subsequent season now episodic fee that is also not creditable. Again, this is as compared to no requirement now. Also, for performers who are over those money breaks, who are over the $65,000 and the $70,000 money breaks, if those performers, because they are being held exclusive, lose their health coverage, there is now going to be an obligation on the part of their employer to make a special payment to the health plan that will have the result of extending their health coverage, so that those folks do not lose health coverage because they lack the protection of this options language. Next slide, please. Also, some improvements for series regulars in the area of the relocation allowance. Previously, there had been a $10,000 relocation allowance for either 2 or 4 seasons, depending on the size of your series order, and that was it. Now it's going to be $5,000 per month for up to 6 months, so up to $30,000, 3 times the prior, with no limit on the number of seasons. So for so long as you are being traveled to the location for the series work, you're going to get that reimbursement, or stipend rather. And based on employment patterns, this is a 153% increase to relocation allowances. I should note that if you have exhausted the number of permissible relocation allowance under a prior contract, you won't be eligible for this. But for anyone doing new work, you will, and who hasn't exhausted that, you will be eligible for it. Next slide, please. We have an improvement to the span money break. This is what you have to be paid before a producer can negotiate with you for unlimited production time. And that has gone from $20,000 to $25,000 per episode, from $100,000 to $125,000 for a series presented in a combined series format. and from 150,000 to 190,000 for a 13 episode guarantee. And again, this is the first increase that we've had in this break since it was introduced to the contract, I believe, in 1971. Next slide, please. Some improvements for guest stars in the area of their start date. Right now, you can be engaged under our contract with no start date at all. You can be engaged for the episode, not given any start date, and this has had the effect of making it difficult for people to obtain other work besides the show that they're a recurring guest on, because you cannot commit to your availability. So they're no longer able to engage you without a start date. They have to provide instead a soft work window, which is the period of your guaranteed period of employment, plus or minus 5 days. Within this window, if you develop a conflict, you let the producer know, and within 24 hours, excluding weekends and holidays, they either have to give you a firm start date, or they can move that soft work window in order to accommodate your conflicting job. If, however, they move the soft work window to accommodate your conflicting job, and that can't be scheduled to a period that doesn't conflict with your professional availability. And by the way, any moving of the soft work window is subject to your professional availability. Then they do not, however, if they're moving it in response to you getting another job and they can't accommodate the other job, they will not have an obligation to pay for any work that you didn't actually perform. Next slide, please. For major role, we have major role now applying for the first time to half-hour and hour high-budget SVOD series and to the first season of Pay TV series. It previously applied to second and subsequent seasons of Pay TV, and it will now apply to the first season as well. Next slide, please. Two new forms of engagement in this agreement. Those of you familiar with the Netflix agreement, these are the same as what we have there. They are the modified deal and modified guest performer. So if you are a modified deal performer, you have to be guaranteed a certain amount of compensation. It's $21,538 per episode. You have to be guaranteed that amount of money. They can then have up to 10 work days for each episode that you are guaranteed, and up to 30 days of production time for each episode that you are guaranteed. Within that, you are free to take other jobs on the days that you are not engaged. The residuals are calculated using total applicable minimum based on 2 weeks at scale for each episode. The junior version of that is the modified guest performer, where you have to be guaranteed at least $14,000. And by the way, both of these guarantee figures increase with the general wage increase, but you have to be guaranteed right now at least $14,000. The producer will then get 8 work days for each such episode that you are guaranteed, and 23 production days, 23 days of production time for each such episode that you are guaranteed. Residuals here are calculated using total applicable minimum based on 1 week and 3 prorated days. Importantly, all of these work days that are being scheduled for the first 30-day or 23-day period, they have to be scheduled at the time of engagement, so you know when you're working and can go get other jobs. And otherwise, again, so that you can find other work, they have to be scheduled at least 14 days in advance and be subject to your professional availability. Next slide, please. Some changes in the areas of consecutive employment for day players now on series and miniseries. The producer can have up to 3 drop pickups per episode, and they can give you a soft pickup date that is plus or minus 4 days. And when they do pick you up, they can pick you up as either a daily, a 3-day, or a weekly. For weekly performers on series and miniseries, they can have 2 drop pickups per episode or part. The soft pickup date is, again, a date plus or minus 4 days. And again, you could be picked up as either a daily, a 3-day, or a weekly. Next slide, please. Some terms around franchise projects. Franchise is defined as a series of related projects that have common settings, characters, and/or storylines. So if you're on more than one franchise project at the same time, There's a particular day that's a whole day for one franchise project, but a work day for the other franchise project, then you're paid for your work day, but you're not going to be paid for the whole day. You are able to agree to the reuse of photography or soundtrack, with the exception of nudity and bloopers, at the time of engagement if it's reuse from one franchise project into another. I should also mention on the intervening days that if there is a whole day that is a whole day for more than one franchise project, you will be paid the highest applicable rate for that whole day, but you will not be paid multiple days pay for the same whole day on franchise projects. Next slide, please.
Right. Before we move on to the AVOD stuff, I just want to note, so that there's no confusion among people. Even though we're talking about franchise projects here, I'm sure people heard during the course of the negotiations, and especially during the strike, about proposals that have been made by the studios and streamers regarding artificial intelligence relating to franchise projects. So I just want to make sure people understand that this does not relate to the AI provisions. There is no franchise projects concept in the AI provisions. There is that multi-picture thing we talked about earlier, but this franchise projects concept is not part of the AI proposal anymore, or the AI package anymore. Thanks.
All right, I'll move on to a high budget advertiser supported video on demand. Right now, this area is free bargaining in our contract. There is no scale that is applicable to this work, and there are only a handful of incorporated provisions from out of the television agreement that apply to this. We will now have fully established minimums and television terms, with a few exceptions, including residuals, that are applicable to this high budget made for AVOD programming. To anticipate a question, if the consumer pays at all, if it's a hybrid type of service like an ad-supported tier on Netflix, if the consumer pays at all, that is SVOD, not AVOD. It's only AVOD if it's free to the consumer. So the way that'll work is your initial compensation will cover 26 consecutive weeks of use on the free to the consumer service. You will get residuals based on 6% of distributors' gross receipts plus P&H for further use on the AVOD service. If it's moved to a pay new media platform, like a subscription streaming platform, then it's the 6% is a traditional residual, and so is the 3.6%, which is inclusive of P&H for consumer pay platforms. And then for use in traditional media, television, home video, etc., the applicable traditional residual formulas will apply. I want to point out that in terms of the television terms that are applicable to high budget AVOD, there are a handful of terms that will apply based on the 2020 contract rather than the 2023 contract. But with that exception, the TV terms will apply. Next slide, please.
Okay, let's talk about background actors. We have an unprecedented wage pattern for background actors, just like we do for principal performers, with 2 wage increases in the first year of the contract. And I do want to just note that one of the cases that we made in the course of the negotiations was that the impact of inflation is felt the most heavily by those at the lowest end of the compensation spectrum. And so we were able to negotiate additional wage increases for background actors beyond what was part of the general wage increase that was also pattern breaking. So the compounded first year wage increase for background actors will total 15.51%. That's made up of an 11% general wage increase that took effect on November 9th, and an additional 4% increase that will take effect on July 1st of next year. So during that first year of the contract, when you compound those 2 increases together, that results in an effective wage increase of 15.51% over the first year of the contract. Then there'll be an additional 3.5% increase effective on July 1st of 2025. Also, and I'm personally very excited about this, for the first time, we were able to equalize the number of covered positions for background actors in the West Coast zones to the East Coast zones. This started out as a desire for us to have a single Schedule X, where all of the terms that would cover East Coast and West Coast employment would be the same. We weren't able to ultimately achieve a single Schedule X yet. There are some provisions, such as night premiums, that still won't be the same between those two schedules. But we did get the significant increases in the number of covered positions in the West Coast zones so that they now match the East Coast zones, including the exclusion of stand-ins from those counts. The result of that is projected to create an additional 10,700 days of covered background work annually. And I'm very excited about that improvement. We can go on to the next slide. In addition, for stand-ins on half-hour multicam shows who rehearse and or perform in the role of a cast member during a run-through, they're going to receive an additional compensation adjustment of $150 and pension and health contributions paid on top of that. And photo doubles who are required to memorize and deliver scripted dialogue on camera will also receive an additional compensation adjustment of an additional $150 on top of their rate, plus the pension and health contributions. We also agreed to the tolling of late payment liquidated damages during a bona fide dispute to make that provision consistent with other late payment liquidated damage provisions in the contract. Next, let's talk about stunt coordinators. We have, for the first time in this agreement, achieved fixed residuals for television stunt coordinators who don't perform on-camera stunts. I do want to note that this additional residual or residual eligibility is going to take effect 1 year after the ratification date of the contract. So this will kick in the towards the end of 2024, but is an important breakthrough because, of course, making sure that stunt coordinators are receiving fixed residuals, not just pooled gross-based residuals, is a really important achievement. We would like to see the calculation methodology on this improved and expect to come back to do that in future rounds of bargaining. We were also able to achieve improvements in the TV flat deal rates with outsized increases of 10% in the first year, actually 10% and 6.5% in the first year, and an additional 5% in 2025. The ultimate goal here was to try and equalize the rates for TV flat deal stunt coordinators with theatrical flat deal stunt coordinators. This doesn't get us there, but it moves us in that direction, and that's an important gain that we achieved in this negotiation. We also heard during the W&W process that there were real problems with flat deal stunt coordinators' time not being respected and them being pulled onto set and kept for long hours, which were affecting their ability to have sufficient rest periods. And so the companies have agreed to issue a bulletin that will tell all producers not to have flat deal stunt coordinators come in earlier or stay any later than is necessary for supervision of stunt work, so as to help reduce the occurrences of that happening. And of course, we'll continue monitoring that ourselves as well. If we go on to the next slide, talking about singers, there's going to be the vocal contractor's fee will now be paid on top of multi-tracking and or sweetening in the contract. And singers who are required to dance, whether it's in rehearsal or on camera, will receive an additional bump of 25% of the applicable dancer rate for doing both of those activities at the same time. So those are gains we're very happy about for singers. If we go on to dancers, one of the main achievements in this negotiation for dancers is the elimination of rehearsal rates. Dancers presently, under the old terms of this contract, were paid less for rehearsal days than they're paid for on-camera days, despite dancers being very clear with us in all of the W&Ws and in presentations during negotiations that rehearsal days in many ways are actually harder work days than on-camera days. So those rehearsal rates have been eliminated, and going forward, rehearsal days will be paid on the same scale as on-camera days. In addition, like with singers, dancers who are required to sing or lip sync, whether in rehearsal or on camera, will receive an additional bump of 25% of the applicable singer rate for that day's work of combination singing and dancing. And the producers have agreed to improve their efforts to provide warm-up facilities or warm-up space as close to or adjacent to the set as possible, so that warm-ups can actually serve their intended purpose of getting people warmed up without letting them cool down before they start work. Going on to holidays, we will have 2 new holidays effective January 1st, 2024. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and Juneteenth. Long overdue, in my opinion, but I am very glad that they finally will take their rightful place in this contract, and we will be observing those holidays going forward. Let's talk about equity and inclusion. First of all, I want to talk about protected access to healthcare. We have achieved a provision where employers will provide funding through the IACF for travel benefits for gender affirming and reproductive health care for covered members who are working under our contract's jurisdiction in areas where the access to those healthcare items are limited if they don't already qualify for benefits under the health plan. And what that means is our health plan already has a benefit for this. If you're covered under the health plan, you can get travel expenses taken care of for purposes of gaining access to reproductive health care. And but unfortunately, there will be times where there are members working under, traveling to places other than where they live and working in those places under our contracts before they actually become eligible for coverage under the health plan due to the timing of eligibility periods and benefit periods. And this ensures that people who fall into that gap will be taken care of so that they also have access to travel for purposes of accessing that kind of reproductive or gender affirming health care. And we also have an agreed recommendation with the producers to recommend to our trustees that the health plan expand its programs that provide for reproductive healthcare access to also include gender affirming care healthcare access. On the translation element, we have an agreement that there will be no translation by performers of their own or another performer's sides. That is additional work that needs to be contracted for separately and bargained for separately as non-covered services. And there cannot be an expectation that our members are required to or expected to do translation as part of their job or their auditions. Continuing on to the next slide. The stunt doubling provisions contain now a requirement that the producer consults with the union to identify additional sources for qualified stunt performers that resemble the performer they're doubling so as to avoid wiggings and paint downs, which are highly disfavored procedures that really shouldn't be used absent an absolute necessity for safety purposes. And establishing this mechanism will give the producers the responsibility of bringing the union into the mix so that we can help them identify qualified stunt performers who actually can double for the principal without having to use wigging or paint downs. On hair and makeup equity, we were able to achieve a consultation right for principal performers so that any principal performer who has concerns about whether the production will have qualified hair and makeup artists who can work with their hair and their skin tone and complexion will have the right to have that consultation prior to showing up on set so that they can be confident that the production will have that capability. There's also a notice that will go to all producers regarding this requirement to make sure that everyone understands that it is an obligation under the collective bargaining agreement. And there's a commitment that's been made to work with our industry partners, including IATSE, for example, to expand and maintain a pool of qualified hairstylists and makeup artists, and also fund training for them so that we can build a pool of hair and makeup people who actually have all of the skills and capabilities necessary to make sure that all performers have equal access to qualified and appropriate hair and makeup artists. One of the areas that we weren't able to achieve in this round of contract bargaining, although I can assure you we're going to be continuing to fight for it in the future, is similar provisions for background actors. Clearly, they are entitled to them and they should have them, and that'll remain a priority of the union to make sure that background actors are also protected and taken care of in this area. If we can go on to the next slide. We have agreed to share aggregated diversity statistics back and forth between the union and the employers on an annual basis. And so that information is going to be used for purposes of making sure that our mutual commitment to reflecting the American scene on screen and providing employment opportunities to all performers, regardless of whether they happen to be in an underrepresented group or not, is actually fulfilled. We also have contract language updates to reflect gender neutral language and remove provisions from the contract that were either sexist or in actuality also some racial and ethnically inappropriate examples from the contract have been removed. Also, I'm really excited to report that we have formally eliminated the casting data report, which was an antiquated method of data collection that was based on the idea that a PA or someone on set would just visually observe people and then report on whether they met various diversity criteria or not. Now we've decided to use a different system where our own diversity census within the union will be cross-referenced with employment data, so we can get the most accurate possible information about employment trends as it relates to underrepresented groups, so that we can make sure that our activities that we're doing to further equal opportunity are being effective. And so we're very excited about that. As one particular example, this will vastly improve the ability to identify performers with disabilities and make sure that disability accommodations and access to employment are improved for performers with disabilities, among others. We can go on to the next slide. If we want to talk for a moment about sexual harassment prevention, first of all, we have for the first time achieved a contractual obligation to use best efforts to engage intimacy coordinators for any scenes that involve nudity or simulated sex. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is the culmination of a years-long process by which we have established accreditation standards for intimacy coordinator training programs and an intimacy coordinator registry. Because one of the things holding us back from achieving this provision in the past was a lack of adequate trained intimacy coordinators to fill these positions. So we're very excited to now have that become the standard. In addition to that, performers have the right to request an intimacy coordinator for other types of intimate scenes. And there's a specific provision prohibiting any retaliation against any performer for requesting an intimacy coordinator. There's also going to be increased notification about non-discrimination and anti-harassment policies, including specific instructions about how to report violations. And this information is going to be made available to performers through call sheets, through postings on set, through vouchers for background actors and paperwork, other various ways to make sure that everybody has access to these policies and to the information on how to report any kind of violation, so we can help continue to provide mechanisms to ensure that we have a safe set that is free of harassment and discrimination. Background actors, there will now be a requirement to notify background actors if a role is going to include nudity or simulated sex. That notice has to be provided prior to the audition or interview if it is known, and in the casting notice if it is known, and at least 48 hours in advance of the call time. And that's going to be done through the background casting agencies to make sure that that information is in the hands of background actors so that they can make an informed decision for themselves about the nature of the work that they're being engaged to do and whether they wish to do it. Finally, there's a provision where there's a commitment to reviewing and updating applicable harassment prevention programs and training programs to cover best practices in scenes with nudity or simulated sex, and handling scenes that might be triggering in a manner that's trauma-informed and more respectful to performers. Now, if we go to the next slide, and Ray, I would just like to invite you to join in on this slide. There's so many things in this agreement that we wanted to make sure we didn't use the entire 3 hours talking through every single provision. However, there is a detailed summary that was posted on the web yesterday and is available to you if you want to ask questions about any of these specific provisions. But here are some of the additional areas where there are important provisions in the contract, including animal monitoring, looping, fittings, updates to our arbitration panels, on-screen credit, significant advances in insurance coverage and how that works, education of emancipated minors, background checks, wardrobe cleaning allowances, increases in per diem, improvements in compensation reporting and residuals reporting, increase in funding and renewal of the Tri-Guild audit program, changes in dubbing and Exhibit Gs, updates to a bunch of outdated provisions, and renewal of expiring clauses in the contract, and the traditional sick leave waivers that we have with the AMPTP. So this, just in a desire to make sure that everybody knows everything that's in there, these are the other topics that are addressed in the agreement. And again, we're going to have a Q&A. So if there's anything in here that you specifically want to know more about, please don't hesitate to put that in as a question in the Q&A. Ray, is there anything on this list that you particularly want to highlight?
No, I think it's best to wait for questions. Nothing here stands out above all others, but they're all
It cut out there at the end, but I think we got the gist of it. So with that, I think we can go on to the next slide to just say this is the web address where you can find the summary of the contract language. You can find FAQs, which we will continue to add to as we get questions. You can find an explainer on our AI provisions. And we'll be posting more and additional information there as well. I know there's been a lot of people who've asked about the full memorandum of agreement and when or if they'll be able to see that. I want to just note that it has never been the case in the past that we've had a memorandum of agreement done in time for the ratification process. This contract negotiation is even more expansive than any of the prior ones, certainly that I've been involved in my last 23 years here. We will do our best to try and get that completed in time to publish it for purposes of the ratification vote. But the 18-page summary of the agreement is what we have ready now, and that's what's posted. And I think that should, that's been what we've always published in the past and has very detailed and extensive information about what's been agreed to in the contract. So we will definitely, do the best we can on that front, but just wanted to let everybody know what to expect there. With that in mind, can we turn it back over to President Drescher? I think she might have some additional remarks at this point, or if not, then we'll go to the Q&A, but I just want to see if she's ready for that part.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say that I hope that you can agree that we hit a lot of milestones with this contract, and it's something that we can all really feel very proud of. We set the bar much higher than we've ever set it before. We resisted all acts of intimidation. They knew that they were dealing with different contenders. We entered this, the largest entertainment union in the world, and I believe that we finished it also the most powerful. We demanded a level of respect and dignity that I believe we have achieved, because over and over again, blank pages were filled with new language, and they leaned into us much farther than they ever anticipated. They were in for a rude awakening, and then they were awakened. And to their credit, they managed to meet the moment. As Duncan said, in a negotiation, you never get everything. And in one of my press interviews, they said that, it's been said that they gave everything, but they didn't get everything. And my answer to that was, well, they got whatever we didn't get, and we didn't get everything, but we went in asking for so much with only the hopes that we could get as much as we got and pass the $1 billion mark, distinguishing this contract as the most successful, largest contract in the history of our industry. There was a section that Duncan had mentioned with regards to performance capture. And I just wanted to detail that for you a little bit of what went on behind the scenes. Because once again, I feel like I have to rebuke some of the low-level people who are buzzing in almost a way that I feel is detrimental to the greater good, and kind of propagandized certain events in a way that's unhealthy for the whole. So I just want to say specifically with regards to that, we had to, and I'm not going to name names. Listen, I was misdiagnosed for cancer for 2 years and 8 doctors. And when I wrote my book, I never mentioned the doctors' names, because the message that I wanted to give was more important than identifying and singling out any particular doctor. And I feel the same way now. I brought in this committee, there were 17 people that could vote, and there were 44 people that were brought in. So 17 got to vote and 44 got to have a voice. And that was because I wanted every single community of this contract to be represented in this negotiation committee. So time and patience was the secret sauce, and everybody kind of got used to the Fran plan that we listen, we learn, we feel, we understand why something is so important to a particular community. And nobody was ever diminished. Nobody was ever thrown under the bus. And with regard specifically to that, our two, committee members who we had become very dependent on to hear their points of view when it came to AI, were on the same page on the AI agreement and are in support of the AI agreement that we ended up closing on. And I believe that maybe tomorrow there's going to be a live IG with Duncan and those two members who are very entrenched in that world. They also work the performance capture world. And for over 20 years, the union has been trying to recognize performance capture as a specialization for our members. And that moment, when it came to either taking the performance capture as it was offered to us, take it or leave it, and put it into the contract, our two experts split in their opinion. One wanted it removed from the contract, even though it had taken over 20 years to get in, primarily because they would not include language for facial capture and motion capture. The other person felt like it's more important to get any capture into the contract where it's never been recognized before. And that person was also supported by our stunt expert and our dance expert, all who will be positively impacted by having performance capture in the contract. But in fairness to the person that felt like, let's omit it, we have to also listen to maybe an outside expert who would be able to illuminate us to the point of view of why it would be a better thing to remove it from this contract. And there seems to be a mobilization of this community, which includes motion and facial capture, to galvanize. And that their feeling was, let's not, make anyone feel negative because they're not incorporated into this contract. And my question over and over again was, what if, we have it in the contract and then in the next contract, we build on that with facial and motion? And because just organizing yourself doesn't in and of itself get anything in the contract. And the stunt community can tell you that. It's very hard to get new language in a contract, regardless of how organized you are. So after hearing all sides in true democratic fashion, the 17 voters were able to vote based off of the fact that there were two people that felt like remove it, and there were three people who were all experts also that felt like it should not be removed. It should get the language in that's taken 20 years and then build upon that. And because there are things that I didn't get that I wanted to, I had to keep wrapping my mind around the fact that, okay, the minute we get this, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and start thinking about the next contract and how we're going to build on it. And one of the concerns was if we passed on it and took it out, of the contract and left the page blank, then in the next contract, when we say, well, we want it now, but we also want it with facial and motion, they may turn back to us and say, look, we offered it to you last time, you passed, it's off the table now, no discussion. And because of the 3 experts that really wanted us to put it in, and because we democratically heard both sides, and because of the way we can anticipate how hard it is to get language on a blank page, the committee overwhelmingly voted in favor of putting performance capture in and building on that in support of facial and motion. So I want the facial and motion performers to understand that their voice and their presence is necessary in this contract. And now that capture is recognized, we will make that a priority for the next one. And I just want you to know that nobody was thrown under the bus. If you read things like that, it's very inflammatory and unfortunate, because it's using social media and chat rooms to advance someone's personal agenda. But there are very principled people who will vote over one issue or kill an entire deal that benefits so many because of one issue that was not obtained. And I implore you to not think that way. This deal has set the groundwork for our future and generations to come. It is major. And if you cannot wrap your mind around the fact, like I have, like other people in the room have, that we didn't get that, but we got this, and this, and we'll get that next time because we're a new kind of leadership that doesn't roll over and play dead, then you're not a good negotiator. You don't understand what the process is. Some people will do that in politics too. This is so important to me, I'll vote for that person, even though that person could be wrong in a million different ways. It's called a single issue voter. There's no room for that in negotiation. In negotiation, you have to weigh and measure and make your informed decision on behalf of the greater good. So that's all I wanted to say to that note. And one more last Buddhist offering for you all. The tallest bamboo tree can lean the furthest. And that's what people need to do in a negotiation. In order to stand tall, you must be able to lean as well. So thank you. And now I guess our Duncan and Ray will begin to answer your questions. And I'm sure, I don't know if you have questions for me, but I think that, I'm here, but most of them should be answered by them being more expert in the weeds of the contract. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, President Drescher.
Pam, before we go on to Q&A, this is one of the things I want to add because it occurred to me it wasn't in the presentation, but I do want to note that there also, as part of our strike suspension agreement, are some extensions to health plan eligibility for folks. And so if we get questions about that, we'll answer the details there, but I want to just let people know that that exists, and you can find that information on the website as well. So if you have essentially a prorated amount of earnings, not counting the strike period, that would qualify you for health coverage during that time, then there's some extensions to health plan eligibility that come along with that. And we probably talk about those more later, but I want to just flag
And
that.
I also want to say, Duncan, that, there was that also talk about that our highest paid members suggested that we lift the cap on their membership dues. And although that cannot replace legally, according to a federally regulated labor union that we are, that money cannot replace the employer contributions to our health and pension. We are planning to leverage that generous suggestion that was, led by George Clooney, and figure out something very positive to do with that money that would help people, and maybe in the way of some kind of privatized insurance premium, that copay that would not, for those that would not make any of the threshold, even if we're able to lower the threshold. So, there's wiggle room for creativity there. And George Clooney said, I would have bet my house and lost that you people couldn't have gotten the deal that you got. So on that note, go ahead, Duncan.
Great. So why don't we go ahead and go to the Q&A, and we'll start with first of all, actually, Pam, you were going to give some instructions. Sorry. Why don't we do that?
Oh, yeah, no, not a problem. Just want to remind folks that we're doing Q&A using the text Q&A function. We have a large group with us today and couldn't possibly answer individual questions other than by using the Q&A format within Zoom, which is very useful and very efficient. So I see several hundred of you have already entered your questions. Ray and Duncan will be answering questions live, and others will be answered by text in the Q&A function. We thank you so much for your interest, and Duncan, go right ahead.
Great. All right. So our very first question comes from Kevin Grossman, who asks, what oversight do we have of how many slots for in-person or Zoom auditions a producer has? What's stopping producers from simply saying they have no slots when in reality they have made little to no slots available? So thanks for the question, Kevin, and Ray, you'll just jump in if you want to on these, or I'll pitch them to you. I think in this case, Kevin, this is the first time there's ever been a provision that specifically required the producers to offer in-person or Zoom interactive auditions. And so there's not a specific number of slots that are required, but the companies are required to provide, a meaningful opportunity for people to have the option to choose between a self-tape audition or an in-person or virtual audition. So if it becomes evident that companies are trying to game the system, that they aren't providing a legitimate number of slots, then those are things that we can address through the conciliation process that Ray described earlier in the presentation, or through grievance and arbitration. And of course, if when we get back into W&W for the next round of bargaining, if it turns out that this has become a problem, then we will address it at that point. But there has been a commitment made to providing a real opportunity for people to make that selection. And I see you actually had a follow-up question right there next to it, which says, if the slots are first come, first serve, what's stopping all of those in-person or Zoom audition slots being simply afforded to more established actors with higher profile representation, preventing up-and-comers from any of these opportunities? Again, there is an obligation on the part of the companies to do this in good faith. And if we become aware of a trend like that happening through members reporting that to us, or we find out about it, then we'll address that through the conciliation process, and ultimately through grievance and arbitration if needed, or through negotiation in the next cycle. Thanks for those questions.
Well, I would just
go ahead. Yeah.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yeah, of course.
Just to say that a similar program was implemented in British Columbia under the UBCP contract, and their experience was they actually didn't fill all the slots. So at least the one example that we have to go on does not indicate that excessive demand for that is going to be a problem. But as Duncan said, if we find we have a different experience,
Great, thanks, Ray. Our next question comes from Michael Weber, who says, and I think the first part of this may have gotten cut off somehow, but it basically says, if pre-employment releases granting permission to use image of human performer, quote, in perpetuity without further compensation be allowed. It means, are they going to be allowed? So certainly not in connection with artificial intelligence. As we talked about with AI, there's a requirement that informed consent be given, and that means there has to be a reasonably specific statement of what the intended use of the digital replica is. So there's not a way to say that that can be used in perpetuity. In fact, that consent has to be obtained for that project, and the only scenario where you can get multiple projects worth of consent is that very specific scenario that we talked about with a multi-picture type arrangement. So no, although that type of language I know is commonplace and used in a lot of releases and things like that, it can't exceed, they can't basically go around the provisions of the collective bargaining agreement by having you sign a release that's illegal under the terms of the collective bargaining agreement. You also asked if a theme park that's also a TV and movie studio has the performer sign such an agreement to work at the theme park, can their image then be used in television and film without further compensation? And the answer to that is no. It doesn't. If a signatory to this contract also owns a theme park and they have theme park employees who sign some kind of release, if anything they're doing is going to be used in a film or television project or a streaming project under this contract, these contract terms will govern that. Thanks for the question, Michael. Anything you want to add on that, Ray? No? Good. Okay. Next is a question from Dave Ferrier, sorry if I got your name wrong. For background actors around employment-based digital replicas, the 48 hours notice will come from who and when? From casting 48 hours before we show up on day one, from production when we are on set. And if I don't consent, won't that mean they'll just choose to not cast or use me, meaning they'll leave me in holding all day and instead use someone who did consent? And then it says, for increased transparency on whether a role is cast, are you saying we will actually hear a week after the self-tape or audition? Well, let's start with the first part of that question. So the 48 hours notice will come from whom? Most likely from the background casting agency, although production could also provide that notice. There's not a restriction, so far as I know, and Ray can correct me if I'm wrong, about who does it, so long as it does get done. As far as when, at least 48 hours prior to the time that work would happen. So yes, at least 48 hours before you show up on day one or more, could be sooner than that. And then you say from production when we're on set. No, I mean, not when you're on set on the day they want to do the work. If you're on an ongoing project, I suppose production could give you that notice at least 48 hours in advance while you're reported to set. But the point is it has to be 48 hours in advance of doing it. And if you don't consent, won't that mean they'll just choose to not cast or use me? That's certainly a possibility. If they know at the time that you're originally being considered for casting, they'll let you know that it might be a requirement of the job. And if you don't want to consent to that, that's fine, but then you might not be cast in that role. If you're already cast for the day and then they ask you and you decline consent, they can't, they can not use you, but they're still going to have to pay you for that day of work. So anything you want to add on that, Ray? If not, there's the second part of this question, but it got cut off in the middle, so I can't really see what the question is. It says, for increased transparency on whether a role is cast, are you saying we will actually hear a week after the self-tape or audition, comma, quote, UDI, and then it stops. So I don't really know what the rest of that question is. Ray, if you can interpret that, feel free to
answer. I can answer it.
Okay.
If I'm interpreting it correctly, it's not a specified time frame when you will know. It will be up to you or your representative to ask. And what the contract provides is that the producer will endeavor to answer the question. So really, the timing is going to be controlled by you and your representative and when you make the request.
Great. Thanks. All right. Next question is from Chuck Slavin. He says, thanks for today's presentation. It seems like every other day we hear in the news about many companies having data breaches, i.e. credit card info, health information. What safeguards are in place for secure storage of replicas, and what does enforcement of cease and desist of usage look like in association to these digital doubles? So first of all, there's not a specific provision regarding the security requirements for storage of replicas. I mean, the reality, of course, is that there are replicas created by these companies, by the studios and streamers. There are replicas created by independent third parties. There are efforts going on that I know about that are out there for artists themselves to create their own digital replicas and have them stored and hosted by a third party that then licenses it to the companies. So there's a variety of ways in which they're created and in which they're stored. And there's nothing specific in this contract about that issue unless I'm forgetting something, and Ray will jump in if that's the case. In terms of cease and desist of usage, the method for dealing with a use that's either unconsented to or uncompensated is through the arbitration and grievance process in the contract. So the process would be to come to the union to tell us that there's a violation of some kind. We then reach out to the company. We attempt to get them to discontinue that use. We may file a claim and then pursue that in arbitration to get a remedy, such as additional compensation or damages paid to you through that arbitration and grievance process. So that's what the process looks like for that. Thanks for the question, Chuck. Ray, I'm just going to assume you'll jump in if there's anything that you want to add. So next is Josh Keaton says, I do a lot of performance capture where my expressions, movement, mannerisms, voice, and emotions are used to bring to life characters that do not have my likeness. What in this agreement would prevent producers from using our emotive/physical work to train AI models to be more subtle, nuanced, and natural without notifying or compensating us if the character is not specifically using our likeness? Even if it's not our face, it would still be our work training our replacements. Was this explicitly addressed? Or is this a big hole in the AI protections? The tech is getting better at a rapid pace, and it's very concerning that there doesn't appear to be anything protecting us from our work being surreptitiously fed into an ever-growing AI data set as long as they don't make the synth look like us. Great question, Josh. A couple of points about this. Number one, in terms of the published work itself, so like a movie or a TV series that's been released publicly, there is nothing that would prevent them from doing that, just like there is nothing that would prevent any third-party company that has access to that material from doing that as well. As you might know, there's ongoing litigation right now over the fact that a number of AI companies have actually ingested material, copyrighted material, without getting any kind of authorization from the copyright owners and use that to train AI systems. And it is as yet an unanswered legal question as to whether or not that is going to be viewed by the courts as a copyright infringement and something that's legally protectable or not. So there's nothing that would stop those companies from doing that or these companies from doing that, except for the efforts that we're making in public policy space to provide additional protections, such as the No Fakes Act that we're pursuing in Congress, such as legislation we've got in the California legislature attempting to address proper consent for the use of AI systems. So there are a number of public policy efforts that are going on to try and corral that in a bigger picture way, but that's something that falls outside the scope of the contract. With respect to a digital replica that's created by these producers under this contract, there is a limitation that exists that says that no additional use can be made of that digital replica without getting your informed consent and negotiating for compensation for that. So with respect to a digital replica created under this contract, there is protection. With respect to the output of the work that might be out in public and accessible to the public, that is something that's going to have to be addressed through public policy. I hope that is helpful. And I think that covers that question. Okay, going on to the next question. Chelsea Schwartz says, under AI terms, section 2E1B1 states that it does not apply to tiling. What if you're tiled into a crowd scene that you never worked on? Ray, do you want to take this tiling question? I think you might be better positioned to answer that than me.
Yeah, I argue that no longer qualifies as tiling. My understanding of how the tiling technology works is that you are being replicated in a scene that you're already working on. So if we found that, we would have to dispute with the producers whether that really was permissible within this exception.
Great, thanks, Fran. I'm going to ask you if you can answer the next question too, the one from Jody Bentley that says, please define modified guest performer and modified deal performer as opposed to a guest star.
So a modified deal performer, modified guest performer, a guest star is a form of billing. Maybe the better comparison would be to the major role minimum provisions of our agreement, where that billing would trigger a guarantee of either 5 or 8 days of employment and require you to be paid an extra 10% across that guarantee. This works a bit differently in that it is a higher amount of money that you have to be paid, and it specifies either 10 or 8 days per episode. As well, it is anticipated that someone engaged in this manner is probably going to be engaged for multiple episodes of employment. And there are provisions here about when those workdays have to be scheduled that don't exist in the major role minimum provisions. Yeah, I mean, I think those are the major differences. More money, rules around when the workdays have to be scheduled, and a probable greater number of days, both in terms of work days and overall production period, I think is contemplated by these forms of engagement.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Next question is, this just popped up on, there we go. And Anissa Matlock says, do the AI exclusions effectively eliminate ADR sessions and reshoots to correct issues with performance? So no, they don't eliminate those concepts. First of all, it is possible for the producer to use a digital replica of a performer to do either or both of those things, but only with the informed consent of the performer, with including a reasonably specific description of the intended use of the digital replica for that purpose. And so there are certain things in that digital alteration section that can just be done using AI technology without having to, secure that additional consent and sort of schedule that additional work. But ADR sessions in general or reshoots in general don't fall into that category. Also, just for what it's worth, the companies have told us that's not their intention. We'll see what happens during the term of the contract. But the companies said that they do not expect to, as a general matter, eliminate ADR or reshoots. They do expect that where there are scheduling conflicts or other reasons why that might be problematic, that they may see some use of digital replication for that purpose. So the contract provides for informed consent if anyone's digital replica is going to be used to do that, and compensation for that along the lines of what we mentioned, which is that it's the equivalent compensation to the same amount of work being done in person by that performer. So I just want to note that that also is designed to eliminate any economic incentive from the cost of the performer side to use a digital replica instead of a human, because they're not going to pay you less because they use a digital replica of you to do that. Okay. Next is Scott Lambright, who says, how is the AI language going to affect voice matching jobs for voice actors who work in loop groups, such as sound-alikes for TV and movies? Can regular group ADR continue safely, and how can we be sure that the job won't be put into a library for AI to use pieces of to create and make us obsolete on future jobs? So first of all, how is the AI language going to affect voice matching jobs? Really how it's going to affect voice matching jobs depends on what principal performers who are being voice matched decide to do in terms of authorizing the use of their own digital voice replica to be used for that purpose. Because if principal performers decide to do that, then that is going to, potentially reduce the amount of voice matching jobs that might be out there, because the actor's own voice would then be used instead of having a sound-alike situation in play. As far as regular group ADR, as I just mentioned, regular group ADR will continue. And how can we be sure the job won't be put into a library for AI to use pieces to create and make us obsolete on future jobs? If they create a digital replica of you in an employment situation, there is a specific limitation that they have to secure your informed consent and compensate you in the event that they use it for any other purpose. So that's the provision that I think gives you some assurance in that regard. Okay. The next question comes from Maria Carmen, who says, if we don't consent to AI, will it affect us getting hired? Do they ask at the audition or when we are on a veil or already hired? And then there's a separate question regarding dancers having group rates, and we are auditioning separately but still have group discounts. So the first question, as regards to consenting to AI, to use of AI, yes, it can be made part of the deal, part of the job, that you agree to the use of a digital replica if they provide you with sufficiently specific details of the intended use of the digital replica. So that is true. Of course, if you've already been engaged and they haven't done that already, and now they come to you and they say, we want your consent to create a digital replica for this reason or that reason, you can say yes or you can say no. If you say no, they can't now undo that engagement because of the fact that you said no. If they want to make that part of getting the job, they have to do it at the time that you're engaged. And that means they have to have that specific detailed information available at that time so they can secure your consent. But when they do it, can be at any stage, could be at the hiring stage or any time thereafter, recognizing that once you're engaged, if they ask you and you say no, they're stuck paying you for that job. Even if you won't consent to their request for digital replica. As far as dancers being still hired in group rates, yes, there are still group rates for dancers. Yes, there were limitations put on the self-tape auditions for dancers to help avoid a scenario where dancers were expected to go out and try to, as Ray pointed out earlier, recruit other people to be in group dances with them for purposes of auditioning. So that is prohibited as part of the self-tape provision, but there are still group rates for dancers. In this negotiation, we also had a proposal to change the group rates provisions in the contract, but ultimately we were not able to achieve that, as well as elimination of rehearsal days, the discount for rehearsal days. And so the decision was made to prioritize eliminating rehearsal days and to come back to the group dancer rates in the future. Okay, next is Heather Gottlieb, who asks, how do performers request in-person auditions? Ray, do you want to take that one?
Sure. At the time that you get the self-tape audition request, there should be information included with the request that will direct you to how you would schedule that audition. What's most likely going to be the case is that the casting director is going to make a window of time available on a first-come, first-served basis, and you will have the opportunity to sign up for a slot that's within that window. But the specific directions for where to look should accompany the self-tape audition request.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Next is a question from Joanna K. or Key. Sorry if I got your last name wrong. Regarding AI, do performers have protections over digital alterations to our appearance so that we are authentically represented on screen? Specifically, protections to prevent digital whitewashing of diverse performers or digital alterations to performers' bodies and faces, particularly consent from female identifying performers before production alters facial features and or digitally alters the shape of our bodies. So, and I think Ray may want to jump in on this one as well, but our provisions on AI limit the kinds of digital alterations that can be made quite significantly. The concept behind it was things that could be done now using existing editing techniques, using VFX or CGI, things that the companies already have the ability to do, that they would continue to have the ability to do that, but that while those changes might be made easier or less expensive by AI technology, that we did not intend to expand the scope of those abilities beyond certain very specific things, such as altering lip and facial movements to facilitate dubbing. So with respect to digital alterations to your appearance, there's a certain amount of cosmetic adjustments that can be made, just as they can be made right now. But in terms of things like, as you put it, digital whitewashing or digital alterations beyond that scope to performers' bodies and faces, that if it's not authorized by that section, by the digital alteration section, then they have to get your informed consent before they can do that. And that means tell you specifically what those changes would be and get your agreement to them. And if that then requires the additional use of a digital replica, pay for that on top of it. So that's sort of the scope of the digital alterations provision. And Ray, I don't know if you want to add any additional detail to that might be helpful.
No, I mean, I think you covered it. I mean, the things they could traditionally do now in post-production, they can continue to do. That, you know, I wouldn't include in that what you're describing. They would be, they would need to get your consent. They would need to provide you with a reasonably specific description of the digital alterations as part of obtaining that consent. And so it would then be up to you whether to allow.
Great, thanks, Ray. Next question is from Woody Schultz, who asks, could you explain the changes in health coverage eligibility in the strike suspension agreement? Has eligibility been extended or lowered for the current year? So thanks for the question, Woody. It is slightly complicated, so I'll try to explain it. And then I'll just refer people to the website to see a more detailed explanation. I think there's maybe even some charts and things like that in the FAQs about this so that people can get the specific dollar amounts. But the concept is, first of all, this applies only if somebody was already eligible and enrolled in the health plan at the time that the strike began. So none of these changes affect people who were not already eligible for health. As that rolls forward, the eligibility requirements just remain the same. For people who were on the health plan and would potentially be losing their coverage as a result of not having earnings opportunities during the strike, there is essentially a prorated eligibility requirement. Depending upon how much of your eligibility period is covered by the strike, there is a lowered eligibility threshold that ranges from 13,000 and change up to higher than that. And if you met that threshold, but didn't meet the full eligibility qualification threshold, you will get an extension of your eligibility period by an additional quarter of coverage and your benefit period. And you'll also get an extended eligibility period, which will help you in the coming time period to supplement those earnings with additional earnings to hopefully reach the threshold for qualification for a full additional year of coverage. I do want to note that there's a special rule for active retirees, which means that if you are someone who is taking a pension and is over 65, but had active earned eligibility that you now might potentially be losing, then you can become eligible for an additional 4 quarters or full year of coverage. That's because of the fact that retirees are people who qualify as that. I know a lot of people don't like that term because these are often people who are still working, but people who are taking a pension, you are on a fixed eligibility and benefit period. That's a calendar year period that's designed to sync up with Medicare. And so as a result, that would result in a full year's extension of active coverage if you meet that threshold. So for more details on that, you can go to the FAQs that are on our website, and you'll find the charts that show you the exact amount of money that has to be earned to qualify depending upon what your eligibility period is. So, I mean, this is a very significant extension of health eligibility and something that, frankly, I'm really proud of our negotiating committee for achieving, because this will result in many hundreds of members continuing to have health coverage for a much longer period of time. I also want to note there's an extension to the extended career COBRA benefit as well that applies to anybody who qualifies for that, regardless of whether you met the earnings threshold or test, and that extends that COBRA coverage. That COBRA coverage is subsidized, so it does provide a significant benefit to the members who are eligible for that. Thanks for the question, Woody.
I'll just add, Duncan, that the chart that you're referring to is on page 28 of the summary. So if you have questions about your eligibility, that's probably the chart.
Thanks. I was thinking it was in the FAQs, but yeah, it's in the summary. That's right. Thanks. So I appreciate that. Next is a question from Nicholas Schreiner, who says, please speak to changes in looping and generative AI protections. Do you want to do this, Ray, or do you want me to do it?
I can start. Certainly the changes with respect to looping have to do with increases to the money breaks in Section 58 of the television agreement, which allow for the producer to negotiate for prepaid looping days. So all of the amounts that you would have to be paid in order for the producer to bargain for those days have been increased. So you'll have to be paid more if there's a desire for a prepaid looping day. As well, for a weekly performer on a theatrical making at least $10,000, there is now an ability to negotiate for prepaid looping time as well. Those really are the changes in looping. You want to speak to generative AI, Duncan?
Sure. I mean, I think that generative AI protections really are about the creation of synthetic fake performers. I mean, and what that means for purposes of our contract is any kind of AI generated synthetic that is made up of trained data from multiple performers. If you use a generative AI system to create a digital replica of a performer, of a particular individual performer, then that's a digital replica. So digital replication covers the replica of any performer by any technology, including generative AI. I just wanted to say that so we can take digital replicas out of that picture and set them aside because they have that full set of detailed provisions that we already talked about. So if you think now about synthetic fake performers, really what we're talking about is generative AI systems combining inputs from multiple people, unknown number, and using those to create a synthetic performer that comes out of that. In the event that that is done, number one, the companies have to give us notice that they are doing it. So probably one of the most important provisions I think we could have negotiated is that. So this can't happen in the shadows and darkness. This is something that happens. And if it happens, we have to be notified of it. And as the union, we have the right to negotiate over compensation or consideration for the creation of performances or performers or fakes like that. On top of that, if there is any use of a specific named performer's recognizable facial features in creating a synthetic fake that comes out of a generative AI system, then there is a right of consent, of informed consent for that performer. So the producer would have to go back to them, would have to say to them, you know, we are looking to use you as part of the inputs that are creating this synthetic fake, and we are asking you for your consent. At which point they have to tell them what with reasonable specificity what the intended use of that is. Then that puts that performer in the position to negotiate for additional compensation if they want to do that, or to simply say no to that use if they don't want to do that, because that would be their right under those consent provisions. So that's how we have addressed generative AI in this contract. Would we like to have even stronger protections against the use of generative AI? Yes, we definitely would. These provisions, however, put us in a position to really know what's going on and to react to it in real time, which I think is really important. And one of the reasons why digital replication has got a more robust sort of contract structure around it is because digital replication is something that is actually happening right now. Many of you, I'm sure, have been scanned when you've gone to jobs. By the way, these provisions on digital replicas protect you from the future use of those scans in this industry. But on top of that, we've already seen digital replicas used in feature films, and we will see them used and actually in television and streaming projects. So I think that is an appropriate place to devote the primary emphasis in this contract negotiation. As far as generative AI and creation of synthetic fakes goes, it's definitely an area for us to be concerned about. It's an area we will want to build on these contract protections, but having notice of any kind of use that's being made of it, as well as a right to bargain over compensation and consent rights for people whose recognizable features are used in it, that was the greatest extent of agreement we could get on generative AI. And let me just say, we started this whole negotiation out with a proposal on generative AI on day one, on June 7th, and the very, very last day of this negotiation, on day 118 of the strike, is when we finally extracted generative AI provisions from the companies that our committee found to be acceptable. So that was a huge, huge fight in this negotiation, and I do expect we'll be continuing to have to battle with the companies over additional limitations in the future on the use of generative AI. I hope that answers your question, Nicholas. Our next question comes from Julia Denton, and she has several questions about AI. Number one, is the AI informed consent a condition of employment? In other words, will we lose the job if we don't consent? The AI informed consent can be a condition of employment in the sense that they can come to you, and when you're being engaged for a job, they can say, as part of this engagement, we need you to agree to the creation of a digital replica, and here's what we will want to do with that digital replica, A, B, C, and D, or whatever it is that they're going to do. That they do, in order to ask for your consent, they have to give you that reasonably specific information. Otherwise, they can't get your consent. But if they know that information, if they have that and they can do that at the time of engagement, then yes, they can ask you for that. And if you say, well, I'm not willing to agree to any creation of a digital replica, or I would agree to the creation of a digital replica, but I don't agree to those intended uses that you've gotten, that's part of the negotiation. And if you all can't reach agreement on that, then yes, they can go and hire somebody else instead of you. That is a possibility. But what they can't do is they can't force you to agree to it. They can't do it without asking you, and they can't change what it is that they said they were going to use it for later on without getting your consent. And of course, if you've already been engaged and let's say you did agree to a digital replica with specific listed intended uses, and now they want to do something different, well, after you've already been engaged and maybe even been working in the project, obviously that's going to increase your leverage in that informed consent conversation. Second question was, can you please distinguish between consent and consent plus compensation? Sure. So we have consent provisions for all aspects of digital replication. We have specific minimum compensation for what's called employment-based digital replicas. That's where you are actually hired by the companies to work on a project and a digital replica is created of you. In that case, there is a specified minimum compensation that's based on the amount of work that you would have had to do in real life to encompass what the digital replica is doing. With an independently created digital replica, like the one we talked about, where maybe you are licensing your replica to them, or you're working with a third-party company to license your replica to them. In that case, you have a consent right, but there's not a specified minimum of compensation because that's going to be negotiable between you and them. And one thing that I think we should all know is wherever you have a right of consent, a right of informed consent, that means you have the ability, if you so choose, to use that consent right to also negotiate for additional terms. They could be monetary terms like additional payment or different payment or whatever. It could also be other kinds of limitations, like a limitation on the time frame of use or the limitation of the types of use or anything else that you want. Nothing in this contract stops you from negotiating better terms for yourself and using your consent right to do so. That's one of the reasons why it's there. Number 3, regarding AI, how is compensation provided in congruent with the time to do the work calculated / determined? So it's the producer's responsibility initially to make that calculation and then to pay you accordingly. If you think that that calculation and payment isn't adequate or is incorrect for whatever reason, just like any other time when you're not paid correctly by an employer, you can come to the union, you can file a claim, and we will then process that claim and determine if in fact they didn't compensate you properly, if they didn't make a reasonable calculation of the proper payment based on that provision. And if not, it's can be taken to grievance and arbitration and enforced in that way. Number 4, audition tapes for excluded times, holidays and weekends. When does the time start / stop? I.e., for weekends, midnight Friday to midnight Sunday. Yes, I think the weekend definition would exactly encompass that. So basically, midnight or 12:01 a.m. on, I guess, Saturday morning through 11:59 p.m. on Sunday night, would be the weekend for that purpose. All right, I think that's all. Ray, you want to jump in?
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that I had stated earlier, I'd given a page reference for where the chart was in the summary explaining the qualification thresholds. I'm told that the format of the document has changed since I last reviewed it. There is now a separate strike suspension document, and that is now where the chart lives. So if I've confused people, I apologize. The chart you should be looking for is now in a separate strike suspension document.
Great. While we're on this little mini break, I want to just say, number 1, we are going to try to extend the duration of this webinar so we can answer more questions. Number 2, there are currently well over 1,000 questions. So even with that extension, we're probably not going to answer all of them. Number 3, I'm going to encourage our staff team who's answering questions in writing to answer as many questions as you can in writing, given the vast volume of questions that have been submitted. And number 4, let me just remind everybody that we will have additional webinars. So if for whatever reason we don't get to your question, please know that there will be additional chances. There will also be in-person informational meetings in some places where you can also go to get them answered. And of course, there is our email, which I know I'm supposed to know what it is. It's tvtheatrical2023@sagaftra.org. So you can also email any questions that you may have that don't get answered today to tvtheatrical2023@sagaftra.org. And of course, we have an FAQ along with the summary that Ray mentioned posted on the website. So that there is that resource as well. So getting back to questions then, I think our next question comes from Angela Wong Carbone. What will happen to holding fees for television contracts? Under the new drop provisions, are there no longer holding fees for protracted scheduling? Ray, I'm going to have to kick that one to you. if you're speaking, we can't hear you, or at least I
Yes.
can't.
Hello?
Okay, now I can hear you. It was very weird there.
You can hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was unmuted. I assume the hold provisions here refers to the obligation to pay for intervening days. And yes, there is a continuing obligation to pay for intervening days, except where that is explicitly carved out. So, in a drop pickup scenario, provided that you are given the appropriate amount of time between the drop and the pickup, and so it's a qualifying drop pickup, then if they are utilizing one of the available drop pickups, those intervening days would not be compensable. If it's a circumstance where you are on 2 franchise projects at once and it's a whole day for 1 franchise project, that intervening day would not be compensable. If you are a modified deal performer or a modified guest performer, and your 10 work days have been set within the 30 days available for that episode, the remaining days will not be treated as intervening days, so they wouldn't be paid for. So there are exceptions, but outside of those exceptions, the obligation does continue to exist to pay for intervening days.
Thanks, Ray. Appreciate that. Also, I don't know, what your audio is kind of iffy, so you may need to turn off your video at some point, and we'll see if that helps or not. So thanks. Okay, next is Michael Berry said, I lost coverage in healthcare last month. Can you talk about some of the new provisions regarding healthcare coverage? So I mentioned already the extensions of eligibility and the extension of the extended career COBRA coverage. Those things are part of the strike suspension agreement, have to be signed off by the board of trustees of the health plan. So that, to be confirmed, is going to take a little bit more time, probably in the next few weeks, maybe sooner. In addition to that, I just want to note that the additional contributions that will go into the plan with those raised caps will make it easier for people, especially people working in streaming or working in television, to qualify for healthcare coverage, because people who've been capped out by those caps in the past, now those caps will be higher, and that means more money from those projects can go into the health plan and also help you generate eligibility. Hope that answers your question, Michael. Next, going on to Kina Bermudez. With the increases to P&H, does SAG-AFTRA have any plan or intention of lowering the minimums for health insurance qualifications for members? That's a trustee decision that will be made by the trustees of the health plan. I'm not aware of that. I do know that we certainly have a desire to see certain changes made to the health plan system, including changes relating to the credit, the earnings credit given to performers who are already receiving a pension, so that they can receive credit for their residual earnings towards their health eligibility. But those decisions will ultimately be made by the health plan trustees. So the main issue that we've addressed in this negotiation is generating additional health plan contributions so that our trustees have the ability to look at those issues and try to take steps to improve upon eligibility and benefits. Thanks for the question, Kina. Next is Paul Baxley, who says, can you explain the NP on the Exhibit G? Has that changed? Ray, do you mind taking that one?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it sounds a bit better, actually.
Okay, good. Yeah, so there is a provision here similar to what was negotiated in the Netflix deal that allows the producer to use a photographed or not photographed notation. However, it also provides for the creation of a separate box that a performer can check to indicate that they disagree with the notation on the page. And there is language specifically affirming that the producer's use of that notation is not binding on the performer or the union. And so if that notation is incorrect, we can proceed in challenging that, irrespective of the fact that the notation.
Great, thanks. All right, next is from Benjamin Davis. Will the new income streams for health, oops, that just slipped off my screen, enable us to restore Plan 2 to our healthcare? Don't know the answer to that for sure, Benjamin. It's certainly something that the trustees can take up once this deal is locked in place. So that's something we'll have to get back to you on. Next, thanks for the question, Benjamin. Next is Stacy Travis, who says, can you explain the new dubbing rules? Also, please clarify what happens to the old guest star top of show label and explain the two terms, the new two terms in more detail. Ray, can I kick that to you?
Sure. I'm not sure what is referred to by the new dubbing rules there. The rules around dubbing, other than what I explained before, that the ability to prepay for a looping day. I know what you're talking about, the reference to dubbing on the last slide. So what happened is there is a term of this agreement that if the company that is signed is going to do their own dubbing, they have to provide no less than the terms of the SAG-AFTRA promulgated dubbing agreement. But the dubbing agreement referenced in the contract was the old, I believe it was the 2014 dubbing agreement. The dubbing agreement has been significantly improved since then, in particular after the new dubbing terms were bargained with Netflix. So the change is that contract, our contract now incorporates the new dubbing contract as setting the benchmark for what has to be complied with. So there are a number of superior terms, including much higher pay, that are in the new version of our dubbing contract that are now being incorporated into this contract. And then the second question was, what was the second question?
The second question was, to explain the new two terms, I think meaning the guest star versus top of show.
Right. Right. So major role minimum, which sometimes people refer to as top of show, is going to continue in the contract as it was, except for the fact that it is now to become applicable to half an hour and hour-long programs made for high-budget SVOD for streaming services, as well as the first season of paid television programs. So the major role has been expanded. And then there are two new additional forms of engagement, the modified deal performer and the modified guest performer. As we had explained, the modified deal performer allows for, you have to be paid at least, I think it's $21,538 is the number for the modified deal performer. For modified guest, it's $14,000, and that's per episode. And then for each episode that you are engaged on in this form, in addition to being guaranteed that pay, the provisions allow for either 10 or 8 work days per episode and either 30 or 23 days per episode of overall production time. And there are rules around when those work days have to be set. For the first period of 30 or 23 days, it has to be at the time of engagement, and thereafter it's 14 days in advance. So these are new and additional forms of engagement on top of the major role provisions. And the major role provisions, as I've said, have been expanded to include high-budget SVOD and the first season of Pay TV.
Great, thanks, Ray. Next question is from Cherish Duke, who says, you mentioned that Actors Access would no longer be able to charge for sides on Showfax. Is that correct? And if so, when will that go into effect? So we did talk about the fact that there's a new protection in this contract from paid casting services that includes making sure that sides are accessible at no cost for casting calls that are done under this agreement, as well as there being no cost to submit, and a prohibition on any kind of preferential treatment based on having a subscription to a casting service, et cetera. So those provisions, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ray, I think those provisions would be effective on the first effective date after the ratification process is completed, which is what, the Sunday after the date that the AMPTP receives notice of ratification. I don't think there's a special effective date for that.
There's no special date. So that's what would apply, what you just said.
Right. So assuming that the contract is ratified, and I think that means that likely we'd be talking about an effective date of something like the 10th of December, I believe. So I hope that's helpful. Next is a question from Dominic Burgess. In the summary on digital doubles, it states that no compensation is required if the digital replica is used in a scene in which the performer is used in person. Can you clarify this, please? Does this mean that there are no more reshoots? They can just use digital doubles not pay because we were in the scene originally. What if a production runs over and doesn't make their day? They can finish the scene after the fact and use digital doubles without paying us. Ray, is that in the background protection provisions, or is that in the principal ones?
Well, that's in the main principal protection provisions. This was the scenario of where you were being moved from one side of the scene to another side of the scene. They accomplished that using a digital replica. If you were already in the scene and paid for the scene, then they would not need to further compensate you for the use of your digital replica to accomplish that, but that would still require that they obtain your consent to create the digital replica in the first place, your consent to use the digital replica. So you would have an opportunity to bargain for compensation, but no compensation is automatically required in the circumstance where the use of the digital replica is limited to, adjusting a scene that you're already in, and have already been paid for.
Great, thanks. And that answers the question. So thanks, Ray. Next is Vincent Amaya, who says, for background, what is the enforcement method for AI to make sure a BG gets paid, especially when a producer can alter the image or merely use an actor's backside? So the enforcement method, I mean, there's a couple of different provisions that relate to background payment under this contract as it relates to AI. Number one is the fact that the count has to be maintained. So they can't use a digital replica in a scene in lieu of hiring a actual background actor to be in that scene, as long as it's under the numbers. So for covered background positions, that applies to all of those positions. And so if there is an insufficient amount of hiring to account for all of the background that appear in that ultimate scene, then that would be a very easy claim for us to make. And then, of course, as far as altering the image or even, using the backside of the performer, if the performer is still engaged for that shot, there is a prohibition on any kind of evasion of paying background actors by use of their digital replica. So we would be able to file a claim for that and secure payment for the background actor in that scenario as well. So I think there's really sort of a belt and suspenders approach between those two pieces. Thanks, Vincent. Next is Hudson Brooks, who says, thank you so much for the accomplishments. Provisions that apply to minor SAG members seem to have been extremely low priority and almost forgotten, specifically during the casting process. Aside from the extra 24 hours they get for submissions, was there ever additional conversation regarding limiting the number of pages expected for a first audition, or less ask during the self-tape process? Also, minors is a wide range, considering we are applying the same provisions to a 7-year-old as to a 17-year-old. Is SAG okay and comfortable with this portion of the agreement? So as it relates to self-tapes, I mean, certainly we did achieve, as you noted, some additional time for minor performers to have to complete a self-tape so that it could be done in a way that's more consistent with their education schedules and with, their life schedules. So I think that certainly is an important improvement that relates specifically to minors. As far as the idea of limiting the number of pages differently for minors, I don't recall that being a topic of specific discussion. I may not be recalling, and Ray will jump in if I'm mistaken about that. But I think primarily the concern was the work schedule, including the audition schedule for minors, and making sure that there was additional time so that could be made flexible to accommodate the unique needs of minors. So as far as applying the same provisions to a 7-year-old as to a 17-year-old, as a general matter, other than work time, the educational requirements and things like that in our contract are all laid out, and in the self-tape provisions, those really aren't applicable because that work's being done at home, or certainly not being done in studio. So I think we are comfortable with those provisions as it relates to minors. And Ray, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Only that there was no proposal, including no proposal coming out of W&W to have a different page count for minors. So that was not something that was discussed.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the question, Hudson. Next is Nicole Orabona. The giving of consent for AI replicas after death is concerning to me. The summary states, if a representative cannot be found, the union can give consent. How will that work? So so first of all, I just want to remind everybody, there was a point in time in this negotiation where the producers wanted us to agree that they wouldn't even need to get consent for a deceased actor to make a digital replica and use them. So obviously we fought that off, And this contract requires that for any type of use, whether it's before or after death, where there's creation of a digital replica, that the producer has to secure consent. And if they didn't do it before the person passed away, then the consent can be obtained from that person's estate or representative. So in the event they can't find that estate or representative, then they can come to the union. How that would actually work is we will try to locate the estate or representative ourselves and put them in contact with those individuals. If the person either doesn't have an estate or representative due to perhaps dying intestate and not having any heirs or relatives, et cetera, or if for whatever reason there's a dispute over that, then the union can grant consent so that the project can continue going forward. That consent, one of the things we've talked about is setting up a system where performers have the ability to deposit with us essentially guidance to be used in the event that that consent situation comes up. We're expecting that to be a very rare thing because, of course, we have many deceased performers whose beneficiaries and heirs are receiving residuals and other payments through the union, and we have contact information for those estates. But in those rare circumstances, we expect to have a system where performers can give us direction about how they want that to be handled after their death, and we can help make sure that's complied with and enforced. Thanks for the question. Next question comes from Brian Silliman, who says, what happened to asking for 1% of streaming residuals? Great question. I think what you mean by that, Brian, is 1% of revenue, I'm assuming is what you mean, in our original streaming revenue share proposal. So just to sort of remind people where we started out, we had initially proposed a 2% of revenue share for streaming. That was our original proposal back in June. During the 35 days of bargaining, the companies refused to engage on this proposal other than to simply say no, they would never do it. They wouldn't even consider it. They wouldn't discuss it. It didn't make sense, et cetera, et cetera. So then, obviously, after the negotiations, the extension, and after we went on strike, we continued to press for this issue because our desire was, as I think Fran had put it very directly, for us to get into another pocket, to create another revenue stream for actors working in streaming, because the streaming business model has been so difficult for people to maintain a career and to make a living. And so what became evident during the discussions, especially after we sat down with the CEOs starting in October, was that there was no scenario in which these companies would agree to directly attach a payment to their revenue stream. I mean, they're wrong to not have done it, to have refused to do it. Our proposal was righteous and justified, but we were not going to be able to achieve it in this negotiation. So again, with our primary focus being find another pocket to go into and create a new revenue stream for our members so that they could have a more sustainable life working in streaming, we ultimately made some modifications to that. We went from 2% to 1%. Then we pivoted from a direct connection to revenue into a hybrid model involving subscriptions and viewership. That was the 57 cents model, if you remember that, the less than a postage stamp model. That was the economic equivalent of the 1%, by the way. That wasn't a reduction or an increase. It was a different structure, but with the same amount of money. Obviously, even though we thought that that should be well received by the companies because it addressed the primary concern they had brought to us at that point, which was no attachment to the revenue stream. Then once we addressed that concern, their new concern was it's just too much money. The cost is too high. And so we negotiated over that with them, ultimately pivoting to the proposal that we have now, or the agreement that we have now, which uses the same sort of inbound money structure as the Writers Guild system, the streaming bonus structure that's based upon the shows on the streaming platform that exceed 20% of viewership and triggers an additional payment. Obviously, the amount of money that comes in is twice as much in terms of a percentage as in that previous agreement. And a part of that goes into the fund. And so what I would just say is the key part of this whole agreement as it relates to that is the fund, because what the fund allows us to do is to provide access to that revenue stream to a much broader group of members who work in streaming than only the members who happen to end up on the shows that hit that success threshold of 20% of viewership. So while those individuals will receive the majority of the money that comes out of this program, there will be a substantial portion that is put in this fund to be distributed to a wider group. And that is how we actually have generated a payment stream that comes out of a different pocket. It's not the traditional residuals payment. It comes out of the success bonus pocket, and it's additional new money. And that new money is distributed through this mechanism to a broader group of members. And over time, we expect to negotiate those numbers up and to provide increased money. Obviously, the net amount of money is considerably less than we had originally proposed. And I guess what I would just say to that is, our original proposal was designed to be a proposal to be bargained from. In any negotiation, you expect to have to make compromises. We didn't expect to achieve 2% or even 1%. We hoped to achieve more than what we have in this deal in terms of the dollar amount, but it is a substantial dollar amount. And we're talking about roughly $40 million a year across that bonus stream and those two methods of distribution. And we expect that to grow over time. So I think that's the answer to what happened to it. Brian, I know it's kind of a long answer, but I hope it gave you some insight into that. And ultimately, this is a negotiation is about using the maximum leverage you can generate to get the maximum gains that you can get. And in this contract overall, while there are certain pieces where we would have liked to see more or things that could have been different or we would have liked to have been different, we pressed these companies so hard for so long. I personally believe that we did get every penny off the table that we could after being on strike for 118 days and doing everything that we did to increase our leverage during that time.
Duncan, if I can interject a minute,
Sure.
because that was kind of my brainchild. I just want everybody to know that although the most important thing is that we found ourselves more money from somewhere else that never existed before. And when we started the first 35 days of negotiation, this is something that I was obsessing on even when the negotiating committee was still in plenary, trying to figure out what the proposal package was going to be. And I said to Duncan, we've got to get into another pocket. We need more money because the way that streaming works doesn't really fit with the way the residual structure was modeled, which was a perfect fit for linear television. So we came up with this revenue share model, which is absolutely elegant and makes perfect sense for streaming. And for the first 35 days, they kept saying no. And we kept saying, well, we're not taking it off. We're putting it on hold. It's not going away. We could talk about this, that, and the next thing, but it's not leaving the table. And then in the 11th hour, after we were almost done with the extension, the 12-day extension, Duncan and I called several of the CEOs. We said to the AMPTP negotiators, we're going to go over your head. And we want to talk directly to the CEOs, which is what we did. And ultimately, they said no, too. And so the strike began. And it took them a very long time to talk to us again, as you well know. We didn't really start talking from that date in July 14th all the way to like October 6th, I think it was, or something. So then when we started talking, they were very, very resistant to giving us any more money than what was already established. No to putting new language on a blank page. And what they had offered to the Writers Guild did not feel like it was going to accomplish what our intention was. But they were never going to do that were it not for the fact that we were pushing so hard on the revenue stream. They were never going to do that. The Writers Guild didn't even ask for it. So they came up with this and they explained this to us, that we really wanted to lean into what your needs were. We heard what you were saying. The logic of the argument that these two things don't really mesh together in a way that's going to compensate our members so that they can continue to make a living on this platform as they did in linear television has to be fixed. And so they powwowed amongst themselves and thought, okay, going into their, revenue share may be a bridge too far, but we have to give them something. We have to do something. We have to give them more money in a new way. And that was when they came up with that. And as Duncan had said, we realized, okay, look, for me, money's money. It's just as green wherever it comes from. And if they feel happy or doing it in this kind of a little more convoluted, not as elegant way as a first leap into new money, so be it. But it had to go into a fund so that we could spread a wider net. And the fund wasn't agreed to, like November 7th. So I just wanted to clarify that with all of you. And the way I think, the way I try and understand what life is presenting to me, I saw the revenue share as not as a means to an end, not the end itself. That sometimes things get presented in a way that disrupt everything, create a conversation, bring attention, and becomes a means to an end. And that's the adjustment that we had to make. Maybe it's not the end, but the means to the end, because it got us to a brand new stream of revenue and another blank page got filled. That's all I want to say. Thanks, Duncan.
Great. Thanks, Fran. Okay, moving on to our next question from Omari Washington. Have there been any adjustments to the work hours on set? I don't think so. Ray, maybe I'm mistaken. Can you address that?
No, there's nothing in the deal that adjusts work hours.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Omari. Next is Larry Sullivan, who says he's asking a question for someone who can't attend. Does this exceptions to consent for digital alteration, adjusting lip and or voice of performer to a foreign language for license or sale to a particular market mean that dubbing jobs basically go away and the actor doesn't get compensated to get dubbed, essentially? So well, first of all, the adjusting lip movements to performer is something to improve upon dubbing, is something that a company that we are very familiar with called Flawless AI is doing now. And that does not involve the replacement of the dubbing actor. What it involves is the dubbing actor dubbing with the original script. Instead of adjusting the script language to match the mouth movements of the performer, the mouth movements of the performer can be adjusted to match the directly translated or authentically translated script, the goal of which is to create a more authentic version in dubbing rather than a modified version that better fits the lip movements. As far as the creation or use of synthetic voices for purposes of dubbing, that, number one, if it's a replica of a person's voice, of a performer's voice, it falls under the same provisions for digital replication. Number two, if it's a synthetic voice that would be created under the GAI section, for example, the notice and compensation provisions would apply, as well as the ability for us to sort of use that information for future negotiation purposes. So I don't, there is obviously the concern because voice actors are really on the cutting edge of the AI challenges because the technology can be more readily applied in voice just because it's a little bit easier from a technical perspective than it is to do it in audiovisual. So those provisions are there to protect against the unauthorized or without informed consent use of a digital replica of your voice as a voice actor, or doing that without compensation. But it is true that there is a risk that's out there of generative AI being used to create synthetic voices. And we'll have to use our notice and bargaining provisions to make sure that the economic incentive is not there to do that. So that's the answer to that question. I don't know, Ray, if you want to add anything to that. Otherwise, we'll go on to John Forbes, who says, are the additions to the contract for streaming residuals for projects moving forward, or is any of it retroactive? Well, that's an interesting question. I do want to just note that the The streaming bonus money that we were just talking about, that both Fran and I referenced, it's going forward, but it applies to any project that's exhibited, any made for high budget SVOD project that's exhibited on a streaming platform, regardless of when it was originally produced. As far as anything else, I'm pretty sure it's not retroactive, but I just asked Ray to confirm that.
That's right. The other improvements to high budget SVOD would be applicable for an episode that commences principal photography the Sunday following the AMPTP's receipt of notice of ratification.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Next question is from John Peters II, who says, if a background actor refuses to be scanned when offered a job, can they be denied the job? So yes, if the producer can tell you at the time you're being engaged for the job that that they want to create a digital replica of you, and they can provide the detailed information, the reasonably specific information about the intended use, then you at that point would have to either say yes or no to that. And if you don't want to say yes to that, then they can go and cast somebody else who will say yes to it. Once you're engaged, of course, if they haven't already gotten your consent to do that, and then they come back to ask you, then you could say no to it. And they may end up having to engage somebody else in order to do it, but they won't be able to cancel your call or not pay you for that work. They'll still have to pay you for that day. Thank you. And let's see. Sorry, this scrolled up. Here we go. Next is Rory Ross, who says, in regards to digital replicas, will these new provisions and protections be applied to previous contracts that AMPTP companies snuck in these scans to be used in perpetuity? And the answer is yes. The provisions that are here and regarding consent, informed consent, compensation, as far as any digital replica, will apply to the use of those digital replicas after the effective date of this contract, even if the digital replica was created before the effective date of this contract in connection with employment under the contract. So yes, going forward, you will have those consent and compensation rights, regardless of when the digital replica was created. Next is, let's see, sorry, some things have been going away here. Looks like the next one is Brian Kimmett, who says, how specific will the usage description be in the consent agreement? It's defined as being reasonably specific. And so what that means is that they have to tell you what the intended use is. They have to be able to advise you of things like, it's going to be used to replace you in this particular scene. It's going to be used because you're going to be engaging with a non-human digitally created character, and so that's the reason, and it's going to be used in this way. It's not to the level of having to have every moment of use necessarily scripted out, but it is to the level of not saying something like, we just want your consent to use your digital replica in this project, or we just want to use your digital replica in this project whenever we need to to have it and you're not available, or something like that. It has to be reasonably specific, and over time that term will become defined through claims that we may file and through interpretation issues that we'll bring during the course of the term of the contract. Let's see. Next is Margaret Odette, says, streaming success metrics, who will have visibility into and affirmation of those percentage numbers? There'll be a designated, under the transparency provision, there'll be a designated set of union representatives who will be able to actually see that information so that we can use it to, confirm calculations, do the necessary computations for the fund, and validate and enforce that payment is being made. They won't be generally released. However, aggregate information can be provided by the union to members that doesn't include the specifics for each particular project, but include a more general aggregate information. I will also note that the provisions specifically allow us to audit those figures. So if we have doubt in the validity, veracity, or authenticity of any of the viewership data that's been provided to us, we can engage a third-party auditor to go in and audit those figures to make sure that they are accurate. Next question comes from Brandon Morales, who says, how often do streaming services hit that success metric? It's not really the service hitting the metric, it's the number of programs on the service that hit the metric. And our projection of the money that's generated by this by this proposal kind of reflects the past history of what would have qualified under the streaming success metric. So I don't have an exact number for you. I think we have had access to a list of projects that would have qualified for that in last year in 2022. It was many dozens of productions. I don't have the exact number, but it was, not hundreds. So that's the sort of ballpark of where that will fall. And again, based on that data, we've projected that generates about $40 million a year across those two distribution pieces that are part of it. Thanks, Brandon. Next is Mark Stebitz, who says, Section 11 of the summary discusses increases in background actor counts for the Los Angeles area and breaks down those increases for television motion pictures and theatrical motion pictures, but nothing about increases in counts for short form 30 or 60-minute TV shows. The current Background Actors Digest clearly breaks down the count for these three categories. The summary does not include short form background count and only motion pictures. Please advise about increases in short form TV background actor counts and why is that category not included as in the past? Ray, can you address that?
I'd have to go look at it. That's not something that I tracked. It's going to track whatever is in the New York zone. But I'd want to check with Stephanie Perry and make sure I understand that.
Okay. Mark, we may have to get back to you on that particular concept, but I noted in your question, you reference in quotations short form 30 or 60-minute TV shows. And so I do want to note that there is, the information that we gave related to there being a television number and a theatrical number in terms of coverage numbers. So, I'm just asking our staff to flag that question so we can get back to you on it after we check into it. Thanks for raising it. Next is Dustin Milligan, who says, can a studio bypass having to use our names when prompting AI by instead inputting the character names that they already own the rights to and therefore avoid consent and payment? So certainly we would take the position that is an effort on their part to circumvent the provisions of the contract, and we would challenge that. And of course, a character is not necessarily attached to your identity as a person. I mean, we don't have a concept of owning a character in this contract and on the part of performers. And of course, there are many characters that have been played by multiple performers. So that is an issue that we'll probably have to address in enforcement if it comes up. But regardless, we will have to be given notice under the contract provision anytime it happens. So we'll have the opportunity to challenge that if it looks like the companies are trying to do that. Thanks for raising the question, Dustin. Next is Waltriesa de Leon, who says, what are the number requirements for SAG BG on set in Wilmington, North Carolina, not including stand-in and photo double? How is SAG protecting those actors who say no to AI? I do not know off the top of my head about the Wilmington, North Carolina area, what zone it's within and what the number requirements are. So Ray, if you know, or if someone else wants to answer that, that's great. But how are we protecting actors who say no to AI? I mean, our primary goal in this negotiation was to ensure that actors have the right to say no to AI, that you have the right to be informed about what it is the companies want to do using AI as it relates to you, and be able to say if you are in agreement with that or not, because not all actors feel the same way about how AI can or should be used in connection with their performance. So our focus from the very beginning of the negotiations was the informed consent concept and the fair compensation concept. And that's how we are protecting actors who want to say no to AI, which is ensuring that you have the right to say no, the right to be informed about what it is that would be done with AI if you said yes, and that those rights are legally enforceable, which they are in this contract. But as far as that first part of the question, Ray, do you have anything you want to say about that?
It depends whether Wilmington is within 300 miles of Columbus Circle. I think it is. And so the New York numbers would apply. But again, I'd want to confirm that with the local execs.
Okay. Hopefully that helps out, Waltriesa, and we can give you more detailed info on that if you need it.
Oh, the local execs are very fast. Wilmington is not in a zone. So Wilmington, it's not in a zone.
Okay, so if Wilmington is not in a zone, then that means that those contract provisions don't apply to work done in that area. Okay, next is the question from Mercedes Maria, who says, thank you for sharing these updates. Could you elaborate a bit on casting sites such as LA Casting and Actors Access? Will we, as actors, need to continue to pay, even though those services have free options? In many ways, we have been required to pay for all the features. Someone just did something that took away that question for me, so I can't read the rest of it. Just to the staff who's working this, don't click anything on those questions until I finish reading them, because I no longer can see the rest of the question. But I'll do my best to answer it. Mercedes, sorry if I missed something, but right. So these services I expect will continue to offer subscription options, and they may offer additional services, to their subscribers as part of that. But what they can't do is they can't require you to subscribe to those services or pay any fee to have access to sides, to submit a self-tape, or to access those kind of listings, for open calls. So those pieces you will not need to subscribe for. If you want additional services from those companies, if you find them to be of value, then you will have the option to do that. But there is also a prohibition on those companies or the producers giving any preferential treatment to anyone who subscribes. So if you see something like a company saying, if you subscribe, you'll be at the top of the list, the casting people will see your submissions first, anything like that, bring it to the union's attention, because those kinds of practices are no longer permitted under this contract. Thanks for the question. Next is Sarah Sokolovich, who says, will we be expected to address AI consent forms in the audition process? Would we potentially be held back from being hired and or let go, let's say, if pinned? It's unknown whether they will try to do that early in the process. Certainly, it could be possible, if they have the information, that they might tell you about the intent to create a digital replica, so that you're aware of it early on in the process, in case it's something you want to just automatically say no to, or you won't agree to. Of course, to get your actual consent to the creation and use of the digital replica, they have to have reasonably specific information about the intended use of the digital replica. So if they don't have that yet while you're in the audition process, then they really can't get your consent yet at that time. So we'll have to see how that all plays out. But in any case, what you can rely on is the fact that you will not be put in a position of having to grant your consent to anything regarding the creation or use of a digital replica without having reasonably specific information about the intended use of that digital replica. Next is a question from Devin Alora, who says, if a background actor gets paid for their AI's hours for the work that day, does it go to their health and pension hours? So yes, there are pension and health contributions on any compensation that's paid for that use of a digital replica. Thanks for the question. Next is a question from Michael Weber, who says, is the union only able to make a decision on whether the image of the deceased actor can be used if the estate can't be reached? And the answer to that is yes. So a representative of the union or a panel of representatives who has never met me and doesn't know my values can decide if my image can be used to reanimate me as a principal after death. If no one can find your representatives or your estate, then we would turn to whatever instructions you would have given the union during your lifetime about your desires and intentions in that regard, and then be in a position to answer that question. So as I mentioned, we expect to set up a process by which members can deliver those instructions to us. That'll be kept on file in the event they're ever needed. And once this contract is ratified and we know these provisions are going into effect, then we will be in communication with members about exactly how you can go about doing that. Thanks for the question, Michael. Next is Tunisia Hardison, who says, do child performers receive pension credits as well? As a general matter, the answer is yes. And I think there's at least one exception I can think of to this, but as a general matter, yes. And Ray, correct me if I've misstated anything there.
No, there's an exception for background minors in the West Coast zone. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Rosana De Leon says, how are we going to access the information about how many viewers a show has, specifically shows on streaming services? So the streaming services will provide the union with that information. A designated set of union representatives will have access to see that detailed information regarding every program. and that information will then be used to confirm that payments have been made correctly, both directly under the streaming bonus program and also to the fund. Thanks, Rosanna. Next is Mark Burnham, who says, please explain why Schedule F performers were excluded from consent and compensation in regards to AI regs. Please expand on how residual reporting has changed, particularly on streaming and ad-supported platforms. Thank you. So first of all, Schedule F performers are not excluded from consent in regard to AI regs, AI regulations. So let's be very clear about that. Schedule F performers have the same rights of consent as any other performer under these provisions for the employment-based and independently created digital replicas. But I think what you're probably referring to, Mark, is the fact that from a compensation point of view, Schedule F performers aren't automatically entitled to any additional compensation for the use of their digital replica on a project where they're working. And the reason for that is Schedule F performers, by definition, have, by virtue of getting paid the Schedule F minimums, are entitled to, or the producer's entitled to negotiate for unlimited work time. So that means that the producer could just call you in and have you do that same work that the digital replica is doing, and you wouldn't get paid any extra for it. So in light of that fact, that made it difficult to argue that a digital replica where you did not have to come in or actually do any work should get paid when you yourself as a human being would not get paid any extra to come in and do that work. As far as the compensation structure on independently created digital replicas, that is a matter of free bargaining between the Schedule F performer, and also for any reuse of an employment-based digital replica, that's also a matter of free bargaining in terms of what the compensation would be. But those consent rights remain in place. So you can always just say no to that use if you're not happy with the compensation that's been negotiated. And of course, we would like to have minimums in place for Schedule F performers. But in terms of prioritization, the top priority is making sure that performers who earn at lower levels than Schedule F minimums were protected with minimums, with minimum compensation levels in this agreement. And so that was our first priority. I imagine we may go back in the future to look at that, but we would not want to set, for example, a day player minimum as a minimum for the reuse of a digital replica of a Schedule F performer, because that could, in essence, drag down the compensation that those individuals could individually negotiate for. So it was a complicated decision, but one that was ultimately made with the leverage that we had in regard to AI, and to ensure that fundamentally that consent protection remained strong and in place, which it does. You also asked us to expand on how residual reporting has changed, particularly on streaming and ad-supported platforms. Ray, would you mind taking that part?
Sure. The change in residuals reporting relates to residuals that are calculated based on revenue, that are calculated based on distributors' gross receipts. And what's going to happen is that the foreign receipts and the domestic receipts are going to start being reported separately. For those formulas, the dates vary according to company, but eventually we will get to all of the major signatory companies reporting those grosses separately.
Great, thanks, Ray. Next is Peggy O'Rourke, who says, please explain the potential consequences of a no vote. Will we lose the leverage we had? Will shows have to shut down? Does this contract have to be negotiated from scratch, or does it continue from what has been agreed to? Can the AMPTP impose that we continue to work on a TA that has been voted down? Thank you. So interesting questions, Peggy. So if there were a no vote, if this deal were not ratified, then we would have to go back to the table, and we'd have to make a determination. The negotiating committee and the national board would have to decide, do we reinstitute the strike? We would have to go back into bargaining. There is no guarantee that the provisions that have already been agreed to will remain on the table. Companies and the union have the ability to pull back proposals or change proposals under those circumstances. It would basically be a continuation of negotiations, but without any assurance that what is already on the table would remain on the table. And we would have to see how that would play out. Obviously, reinstituting the strike is something that could happen in the event that we went back under those circumstances. You'd have to evaluate. I think we'd all have to evaluate what the likely success is of going back in, reinstituting a strike under these conditions, and attempting to negotiate for better terms. We already were on strike for 118 days after bargaining for 35 days on the contract. We had the leverage of having a dual strike with the Writers Guild for a significant portion of that 118 days. And from my point of view, we gained the maximum amount of leverage, and we reached a deal right at our point of peak leverage in this process. Continuing the strike into the holiday period, in my view, would not have resulted in additional leverage. It would have probably deleveraged us for a variety of reasons. And I do not believe we would have been able to gain additional gains in this contract by staying on strike longer. So obviously, different people may have their own opinions about that, but the consequences of a no vote would be that we would need to return to the table and continue negotiating, and hope that we would be able to find that pathway to a deal either with or without a strike in that event. As far as can the AMPTP impose that we continue to work on a TA that has been voted down, the AMPTP could implement, if we reached impasse, an agreement, an offer that they had made. However, considering all of the improvements that are agreed to in this agreement, I think it's more likely that the AMPTP would simply continue to operate under the terms of the expired agreement, because obviously that would mean they wouldn't have to pay wage increases. They wouldn't have to comply with any of the things that we talked about that were part of this deal. I hope that answers your question. Ray, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, great. Next question is from Kimberly Westbrook, who says, in terms of generative AI, you said if there are recognizable features used, you'll be paid. How do we know they won't use images strategically to make sure nothing is recognizable to not pay the performer? How can we be sure they will be honest about who they used in reporting? So first of all, just to clarify, I didn't say you'll be paid. I said you have a consent right and you could negotiate for payment. The consent right is what attaches to a performer whose recognizable features are used in a generative AI synthetic fake. Obviously, if it's a digital replica, that's a totally different scenario. I'm assuming you're talking, since you said in terms of generative AI, I'm assuming we're only talking about synthetic fakes and not about digital replicas. How do we know that they won't use images strategically to try to avoid paying people? They probably will use images strategically to try and avoid paying people, but if their goal is to try and create someone who has a feature that's recognizable from a performer because they think that will be appealing to audiences, et cetera, and they therefore do use a performer as part of the input into that AI system to generate the result, then that's the scenario where consent would be applicable. If they, right now, and a computer animator could go animate a character that's not a human that exists in the world, and that's something that can just happen. And because it's not based on or attached to any person who exists in the world, there is no consent right, nor is there any form of payment. So that is a possibility that something like that could happen. How can we be sure they'll be honest about who they used in reporting? Well, we'll have notice of the instances in which they're doing this, and we can certainly use our bargaining rights under the bargaining provision to get documentation to assure that. I think it's likely that they will maintain those records because given the sort of litigation that has been circling around these types of uses, they will probably want to be in a position to defend litigation by keeping records of that. We'll have to see how that plays out in enforcement, though. Thanks, Kimberly. Next is Lita Lopez, who says, was there no way to say a complete no to all of AI, especially the generative? How often do you think this will be utilized? Will it deteriorate the craft of acting over time? How can we continue to resist the AI overlords? So, as the truth is, Lita, there was no way to just say no to AI. If you look at the kind of resistance and energy that the companies have put into this, there was never going to be a deal where they would agree to limit themselves from using any form of AI. And in fact, they were very clear during all of our negotiations about their concern about competitors developing outside of union contracts who could essentially take this business away from them without having any limitations or regulations because they were outside of those contracts. Obviously, that's not what happened. What happened is we have extensive regulations on the use of AI in the most frequently and likely used areas, which are digital replication of existing performers. And we have some regulation in the area of generative AI with the creation of synthetic fakes that is less likely to be used extensively during the term of this contract, although that's still a possibility. So we expect to continue bargaining over this in the next round. We have biannual meetings with them to monitor what they're doing in generative AI and make sure we're aware of it and on top of it. And how can we make sure that it's not going to deteriorate the craft of acting over time? I mean, I don't think we can guarantee that. Obviously, even now, people working in performance capture, people doing various types of acting where they're not in a traditional face-to-face acting situation, that's something some people like doing. A lot of people don't like doing it and feel that it deteriorates the craft. But the reality is, there has never been a time when we have been able to successfully just block technology from advancing. And so strategically, our best option is to channel that technology in the best possible direction. If we give up the opportunity to do that simply to try and just say a blanket no to it, what will happen is we'll end up with a worse outcome. Instead, it's better for us to use our leverage and be strategic about it and channel that technology in a way that can actually support what actors do and who actors are. So I think that's important. Some of the other things you said, can we do to resist the AI overlords? I mean, that could be a long answer, but I would just say we have a bunch of public policy initiatives that are outside the scope of this agreement, but we've got legislation at the federal level and at the state level that we're pursuing. We have litigation activities that are going on. There is stuff going on at the Copyright Office, particularly the Copyright Office's determination that AI-generated content isn't eligible for copyright registration. That's huge and really important in helping maintain that balance. There's the Human Artistry Campaign, which is a coalition trying to advance the cause of human participation in creative and artistic creation, which we're a founding member of. So there's a lot going on in that space, and we'll continue to share that with you so you can get engaged on that front as well. Thanks, Lita. Next, I do want to just note, I know this webinar was scheduled to end at 1. We're extending it until 1:30 so we can get through more questions. Again, we still aren't going to be able to answer all of the 1,000 pending questions. So we'll just do our best. We're answering as many as we can in the webinar. If there's a question you have that wasn't answered, you can email it to us at the email address we gave earlier, tvtheatrical2023@sagaftra.org. Also check the FAQs and we'll attempt to add frequently asked questions to that list as well. Our next question is Aaron Doyle. Aaron says, for AI, can you speak to why we did not get the definition of an actor as a human in the way the WGA got the definition of a writer as a human and the DGA got the definition of a director as a human? How can we be sure that actors won't be replaced by synthetic performers? So first of all, it's important that we distinguish between synthetic performers and digital replication, because actors are going to be working in combination with their own digital replicas. That's just a reality. It's already happened. It's one of the things that I think is different between the directors and the writers and us, which is, directors and writers have a certain role in production, and there are certain benefits and challenges that come from using AI technology to supplement or replace their roles. That calculus is different for performers for a variety of reasons, not the least of which the essentialness of certain performers to ongoing storylines and to productions, and the incentive that comes from that for companies to want to use digital replication. So, the fact of the matter is that our regulations on AI are far more specific and extensive than the regulations in either of those other two collective bargaining agreements. And that's because they have to be, because our members are currently experiencing the use of digital replication, and that technology has to be both constrained and also compensated for. As far as how we can be sure that actors won't be replaced by synthetic performers, in that definition, meaning a synthetically generated performer who doesn't really exist, our best approach to that is, number one, to make sure that we know when synthetic performers are being created. The companies say they don't expect to do that in any significant number during the term of this contract, but we can't be sure of that. So that's why we have to have notice whenever it's happening. And we can use our bargaining rights to make sure that the economic incentives to use synthetic performers aren't present, because we can bargain to make sure that the cost of using a synthetic performer is equal to or greater than the cost of using either a real performer or their digital replica. And so that ultimately will be our strategy to help make sure that synthetic fake performers don't become a widespread phenomenon or something that threatens the existence of the profession. hope that helps, Aaron. And of course, we'll be returning to this topic twice a year with the companies and in our next round of bargaining, I have no doubt. Next question is from Louis Duval, who says, if there has been a digital scan already captured from projects in the past, are there any compensation for actors under this new contract? So there is not compensation for the time you spent doing that digital scan that was done prior to the term of this contract. But if that digital scan is used to create a digital replica that's then used under this contract, then yes, your consent rights and your compensation rights under this contract will apply. Thanks for the question, Louis. Next is a question from Diana Maria Riva, who says, are Schedule F performers ever compensated for digital replication? Schedule F performers are compensated for digital replication in the sense that the Schedule F minimums encompass all of the work they're doing on the production. So the creation of the digital replica and its use on a production where they appear is already covered by their Schedule F compensation. If that replica is going to be used in a subsequent production, that Schedule F performer will be compensated for it. They have to negotiate for what that compensation is, though. And that's because there is not a separate minimum set for the reasons I already mentioned. So that's something I think we'll continue to look at in future rounds of bargaining. But yes, Schedule F performers do have to do some negotiation, as they often do, but they do have consent rights and they do have the ability to get compensation for that use. Next, Benjamin Davis says, are the drop and pickups for guest stars and day players new? If they're a concession, what did we get for it? Ray, do you think you could take this one?
Yeah, there are additional drop pickups. I mean, there have always been drop pickups, but there are additional drop pickups here beyond what was provided for in the agreement. It was part of an exchange of value that included many of the items that we achieved in the Netflix deal. And that includes everything from the recognition of performance capture to the improvements to the area of options and a number of other improvements. If you look at the Netflix deal, the improvements in the Netflix deal are part of what paid for that were concessions in the area of consecutive employment, including the additional drop pickups.
Thanks, Ray. Next question is from Eli Henry, who says, can you explain the difference between the summary language and the long form contract language? During that process, is there any way to solve for concerns that members bring up now? So sure, the summary is a summary that's meant to tell you all the substantive provisions in the contract. The long form, the MOA, is the full drafted out contract language. And so it's different because it's immensely longer. I expect the finished MOA to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 130 to 140 pages, probably, in comparison to the 18 pages of the summary. But that's because there's a lot of very detailed, specific cross-references and language and stuff in there. And so I do know that people have asked if they can get the MOA. We'll certainly provide the MOA as soon as we can, as soon as it's ready. Those are things we do publish once they're done, but it has never been the case that we have had an MOA ready during the ratification campaign because it takes a long time to make sure that all of the I's are dotted and T's are crossed in that language, and we don't want to sign off or publish a document that hasn't been thoroughly vetted. So I'm not sure exactly when that will happen, but we'll do it as quickly as we can, and we will provide it, of course, once it is done. Let's see. Next question. Oh gosh, this got scrolled up. Brian Silliman says, what is to stop digital copies of A-list actors from taking every job there is? Well, that's a great question. I think number one, the fact that for each and every one of those jobs where a digital replica of an A-list actor or of any actor for that matter would be used, there has to be a consent process, including a reasonably specific description of the informed of the intended use of the digital replica. So I think that, obviously those performers are going to select the projects they want to work in, just like anybody else does, and going to say yes and no to different offers, et cetera. Is it possible that there will be some actors who are able to do more work as a result of having access to digital replication? I think it's definitely possible, although the industry has told us that they see the primary use of this at this time as being to facilitate things like reshoots or other uses in combination with the actual employment of the person in person on that project. So this is something we'll certainly monitor over the course of the contract. It's never been our role or practice to try and limit or regulate the amount of work that any performer can get. Obviously, there is a competitive business, and actors have to go out and search for work and compete to get those jobs. So as we look at how this plays out over the course of this contract, we certainly can consider whether there's any adjustments to that. But at this point, that's pretty much the answer to that question. Thanks for the question, Brian. Let's see. Sabrina Carmichael says, I think it would do a lot of damage control if you could acknowledge and respond to Justine Bateman's specific criticisms, Ray AI. Can you please answer the concerns she's sharing widely in this area? So I certainly am familiar with Justine's concerns. I do think it's important not to just focus on any one person who is raising questions or concerns about provisions. And I think we've addressed a number of them in the context of the presentation and also the questions and answers that we've given. So I do think there is a certain, there is a worldview of concern about the use of AI, particularly generative AI, and the questions about, how are we going to stop AI from making the experience of being an actor something different than what it has been? And what I would say to that fundamentally is to say, any contract negotiation is about maximizing your leverage and achieving the most that you can achieve in your negotiation. It is not a scenario where you get to dictate the outcome to the other party. It's all a question of leverage and bargaining. And so what this AI provision reflects is a prioritization of concerns that relate to the current use of AI in this industry, which is primarily focused on digital replication, and which there are extensive protections for digital replication in this agreement. As far as generative AI use goes, I think we have unprecedented limitations on generative AI use as it is, including the right of notice, the right of bargaining, the informed consent rights that we've talked about. Are they as extensive as we would like them to be? No, of course, we would like more extensive regulations on generative AI, but these are the most that could be achieved with a 118-day strike, maximum leverage with these companies. And I guarantee you the limitations we have in this contract on generative AI, we dragged those companies kicking and screaming into agreeing to them. This was not something that came easily at all. And so, I think Justine is justly cautious about the future. I have spoken to her about our concerns. As a matter of fact, she and I spoke for 2 hours yesterday about it. And I think that, one of the things that she certainly said to me is that she feels that she wanted to share these concerns so that actors who have the leverage, could attempt to negotiate additional protections for themselves into their individual contracts as it relates to AI. And of course, we always support actors negotiating better than the union contracts. That's something that's always been done. It's a built-in feature of our Constitution that we don't regulate maximum earnings for members, that members can always go and negotiate better if they have the leverage for themselves. And so, I think having the input of a variety of voices is always very helpful, but we also have to recognize that collective bargaining is about the art and science of negotiation and achieving an agreement. And that's what we've done in this case. I think everyone, including Justine, agrees we would not be better off without these AI provisions. These AI provisions are going to be a crucial set of protections for our members going forward in this industry. Can they be strengthened in future cycles of bargaining? I'm sure they can be, and I'm sure they will be. But the provisions that we have here now actually provide the protections that our members essentially need right now so they can continue working in the industry. Just as one example, Justine mentions the fact that Schedule F performers have to negotiate for themselves the compensation for use. This is a topic we already talked about, the compensation for use or reuse of their digital replica in subsequent productions. That's true. That's absolutely true. Would it be great to have a minimum for Schedule F performers? It would be great. But when you look at what is absolutely needed and what our priority should be, many Schedule F performers have told me that our priority should be focusing on people who are working at day player minimums or weekly performer minimums and helping make sure that they have minimums for bargaining because they have less leverage. In some cases, they don't have representation. So this is the challenge in this process, and certainly happy to respond to any specific questions about other concerns anyone has raised, Justine or anybody else. So, but this, I do want to just emphasize the AI protections in this contract and really all of the rest of it. There's something that I personally am incredibly proud of, because AI started with a blank slate, a blank page. There was no AI protection in this contract before this negotiation. And to see the kinds of limitations that we were able to achieve and the protections that they bring for our members makes me very proud. And I think it makes our negotiating committee proud too, combined with all of the many, many, many other gains in the contract. So yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking the question. Next question is from Jeff Austin, who says, thanks for all your work. Can you please tell us why there was a sizable no vote on the contract in the national board meeting? Can you give us specific reasons? Thanks, Jeff. And as someone who's been on the board yourself, I think you probably know that it's always risky for me to try to articulate the point of view of a specific subgroup of board members. I think that, there were certain concerns about specific provisions. And I think Fran kind of referenced it in her earlier remarks, which is, sometimes there's a specific provision that someone really cares about, and they decide that they will not vote for a contract that doesn't address this provision in the way they want it to be addressed. And but what you really have to do in this situation, especially after having been on strike for a long time, is look at the totality of the agreement and say, does this agreement meet the needs of our members? Does it address the crucial needs that we came into this negotiation for? And does this agreement reflect the fair, equitable, and respectful deal that our members deserve? We don't really have the luxury of isolating one thing and saying that one thing is the only thing that we care about. And so we're going to vote this deal down for this one thing, keep everybody on strike potentially for this one thing, when that thing is not an absolutely essential piece. So, different people may have different perspectives on it. Some of the people who voted no may feel that the contract overall doesn't deserve to be approved. I don't know, but I know that 86% of our national board, and certainly myself, feel very, very strongly that this contract is the absolute best agreement that could be achieved in this negotiation, and that it meets the needs of our members and absolutely deserves to be ratified. Let's see. Next question is, what are the things that you went for but didn't get now that will be priorities / intentions for the next round of negotiations in 3 years? Great question, Margaret. Well, Fran talked about one of them, which is the fact that in this contract negotiation, we were building structures. One of the structures we built is this streaming bonus money and the fund. Do we want there to be more money in that? Absolutely, yes, we do. I fully expect and hope that that will be one of our priorities in the next round of bargaining, to continue increasing the money in the fund so that we can distribute that widely and make sure that members working in streaming really have the best possible compensation and support in that very difficult business model that streaming has brought to us. And I think there's a host of other things. I mean, some of the ones that I already mentioned during the course of the process. Another example is for stunt coordinators. We really wanted to equalize the terms for flat deal stunt coordinators in television and theatrical. We didn't get all the way there in this cycle, so we're going to need to come back to that and continue pressing on that. Another example is the provisions in Schedule X that we weren't able to equalize. We'd like to do that for background actors. There's a whole host of things. Because in any negotiation you come in, and in this negotiation, we came in with the most aggressive proposal package anyone has ever seen, honestly. And so we knew when we came in, we weren't going to get everything in that proposal package. But we got a whole lot of things in that proposal package. A lot of things people have been saying for many years needed to be addressed or changed or whatever. We were finally able to make that happen, whether it's the Schedule F minimums going up, the pension health caps going up, finally equalizing the number of background actors covered in both coasts, breaking the seal on getting residuals, fixed residuals for stunt coordinators in television, breaking the pattern on minimums. I mean, that is going to have long-term consequences. So, I mean, there's a lot for us to go back to get. And that's great, because we will have another negotiation in less than 2.5 years, starting the W&W process, and we'll be ready. Thanks for the question, Margaret. Appreciate it. Next, and I guess I should just give everybody a warning. We've got about 7 minutes left, so we're going to get through as many questions as we can. Appreciate everybody staying on. Next is from Bob, and I don't know if it's Glauberman. Sorry if I got that wrong. The question is, can you address Justine Bateman's concerns? Sorry, Bob, this is basically the same question that was put in before that I already answered. So I'm just going to say thanks for asking it as well, and just refer you back to my prior answer on the question of addressing Justine's concerns. Next is a question from Patrick Shields, who says, regarding AI and background actors, can you clarify the phrase time spent in creation of replica is work time? Does this refer to time spent by producers creating AI for which we are to be credited additionally, or the time we spent on set creating a replica, which seems to be an issue if it is in the course of a normal workday or straight 8? Yes, Patrick, thanks for that question. That is referring to the time you actually spend on set creating a replica. The amount of time that it takes them to create that or to create the use of that digital replica isn't a metric in this. What the metric is what's the amount of time in the use of the digital replica that would have been needed if you'd done that work in person. So how long it takes the computer to process your digital replica or generate that output is not part of that calculation at all. It's a comparison to the human time that would have been used to do that. And any time that you actually spend being scanned or participating in the creation of a digital replica is work time, and means it starts your day for purposes of getting to overtime hours, or if it's done at the end of the day, it can be in overtime hours or whatever. It's just work time like any other work time. Thanks for that. Next is Tyler Bunch, who says, how will puppeteers, suit performers, and voice actors be protected from having AI-generated clones of their unique pet formative, I think maybe that means performative qualities being generated or used? So we've already talked about that question as it regards to voice actors, because digital replica of a voice is likewise covered under the provisions of this contract. And so all of those consent and compensation protections apply. As far as puppeteers and suit performers go, obviously there is a question of recognizability as it relates to puppeteers and suit performers that has to be addressed in terms of AI generated clones. So this is probably a topic that we're going to have to return to in future round of bargaining if it appears that that's problematic. This would fall under the protections in our synthetic and our generative AI provision. So if someone tries to clone your suit performance or your puppeteer performance, then we will certainly have notice of that and an ability to bargain for that. And if you're recognizable in connection with it, then of course that would be a digital replica. So those are how those protections, I think, would interact there. But we may need to continue working on that area as well. Ray, do you want to add anything to that? Did I miss anything in that response?
No, I think I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay. Next question is from Ethan Embry, who says, in regards to geographic pay discrimination, what is the language that ensures these discussions will occur on a good faith timeline, if any? I don't believe we specified, Ray will correct me if I'm wrong, a specific timeline for those meetings, but we do know of their importance. Let me assure you, I have no doubt of their importance. In fact, when I was at a rally in Atlanta, as one example, it was very much impressed upon me about how important this is to our members. So we will keep the pressure on to make sure those discussions happen in a timely manner. Thanks for the question, Ethan. Next question from Matt Nolan, who says, looping, sound-alikes, voice replacement is how many actors make a living as SAG-AFTRA performers. How will we be protected as human performers with voice cloning and AI-generated performance that might replace a SAG actor? So any kind of digital replica of your voice is protected under these provisions. And so that would require informed consent and fair compensation. I do think an area we talked about earlier in terms of voice replacement and sound-alikes, that is a challenging area, because if a performer agrees to allow the use of their voice to replace themselves, we're not really in a position to stop them from doing that, because the performer may, even for artistic reasons, prefer to have their own voice used to replace themselves. So that is something that is going to be a challenge under this. But what we do have the ability to address is the idea of using synthetic voices under the generative AI provision by getting notice and bargaining for compensation that makes that not economically advantageous to the company. So I hope that answers your question, Matt. Thanks. Next question is Maya Kealoha. Sorry if I got that wrong, Maya. As a parent to a minor whose project was stopped right before completion due to the strike, can you name the biggest accomplishment for minors in the contract? Thank you, negotiating team, for your efforts. I look forward to voting yes. The biggest accomplishment for minors. Well, I mean, one big accomplishment for minors for sure is what we talked about already with respect to self-tapes and extended time to do any kind of self-tape to try and accommodate the minor's schedule better. I think that's an important specific protection for minors. Obviously, there's a lot of protections in the AI section that aren't specific to minors, but which I think will be very important to minors as well. Ray, can you think of another specific provision that's minor related that we should highlight?
Sure. There is a requirement now that people who are going to work closely with minors on set be background checked. And so that's obviously a protection for minors. As well, there is now a requirement that a legally emancipated minor who has not completed the compulsory education requirements of their state must still be provided with education on set. And so if the minor is legally emancipated, but they haven't, for example, graduated from high school in their jurisdiction, then the requirement to provide on-set education for that minor would continue.
Great. Thanks, Ray. That was an excellent answer. I'm so glad that you were the one doing it. Okay. So thanks for that question. Next question is from Julie Dove. And I think this may be our last question because it's got like several parts to it. Number one, streaming bonus. Who's monitoring the streaming data for the streaming bonus? So there will be a contingent of union staff who are monitoring that data to make sure that the payments that are made under the streaming bonus are correct and sufficient. And also, as I mentioned, we have an audit right under that section of the agreement. So if we doubt the veracity of any of that data, we can arrange for a third-party audit of that data to make sure that it is in fact accurate. So then your second part of that question was, can't the streamer just say it didn't hit the metric? Like the studios currently say, these huge blockbusters aren't profitable to people who are supposed to get back end profits. So that's what the audit will backstop. But I do want to note, like the profitability issue is kind of a different thing. That has to do with Hollywood accounting and the definitions of what profits are. In this case, there is a very clear definition of precisely how the viewership data is calculated, and it will be auditable to make sure that no one can do any funny business with that data. Your next part of your question was paid submissions. You're asking, are you saying that sites like Actors Access are going to have to eliminate the service they have called Actors Access Plus, where actors pay to submit for roles? I'm not saying they have to eliminate any kind of service that they want to provide. However, they have to provide the services that we talked about at no charge to anyone who's going to wants, listings, sides, or submissions for roles that are covered by this contract, and they can't give preferential treatment to people who have any kind of subscription, such as Actors Access Plus. If they want to do things in Actors Access Plus, like store additional photographs or reels, or provide other kinds of services that aren't implicated by what we talked about, then that's fine, and they can continue to do that. On AVOD, you said, is freebie programming covered under these terms? It seems like it could be a gray area because it's on the Amazon/Amazon Prime site, but it is 100% free. Ray, I believe that is exactly one of the things we intend to cover by this, but can you confirm? Yeah, great.
Yes, freebie would be covered.
Thanks. And per diem, is per diem going to be paid in advance? We didn't talk about the details of per diem. There are increases in per diem that are coming as part of this contract. Ray, can you talk about the requirement of paying per diem in advance?
Yes, we know that there is an enforcement challenge in that area that we are continuing to focus on. We have a specialized email address for people to report those concerns so that we can intervene in a timely fashion with employers. We absolutely did raise these concerns to the AMPTP in the course of bargaining, and we intend to continue the pressure to get our producers to comply with the requirement of paying per diem upfront in advance and not as part of your paycheck.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Well, I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for now. I do want to just thank everyone for joining us and for all of the great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Please keep an eye out for updates on our future informational meetings, including webinars and in-person meetings. You'll be getting information on that through email, so please do keep an eye out. And you can visit sagaftra.org/contracts2023 for the detailed summary of the tentative agreement, the FAQs we've talked about, the AI explainers, and all kinds of additional information. So please go there to find all that information. And most importantly, please keep an eye out for your voting instructions and make sure you vote before 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Tuesday, December 5th. That's 5 p.m. Pacific, Tuesday, December 5th. That's the voting deadline. And you'll receive more information about that through a postcard in the mail and also in your email. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar or in-person meeting.